shows signs of faltering. Good morning then, everybody. It is Friday morning. We have no progress to report in the overall election count tally in the race to 270 compared to this time yesterday. But of course, the counting has been continuing, and we continue to update you on the latest numbers as they come in. And as we've been saying, some of those key battleground states, Trump, where he has leads, his lead is sometimes being eroded, and certainly that's part of the story we've been dealing with in Georgia. Let's have a look then at futures, suggesting some movement to the downside at the start of the European equity trading session. We're just getting into our stride on the European equity trading session this morning. So the FTSE 100 is fairly flat actually this morning, but actually shows some green. The IBEX down by 0.6%. So we are getting a fairly mixed picture actually in the early start of the trading session coming through here in London. We don't have any great FX markets to guide us this morning. The dollar against the pound is fairly flat. 131.50 is where we trade. Euro dollar 118.39. We are down now though 0.1% on the stock 600. The FTSE flat as I mentioned, but the CAC 40 opening to the downside, down 0.4%. The IBEX down by 0.6%. So we keep an eye on the fight against COVID. We keep an eye on the US election race. We keep an eye on some of the data coming through, because we've had data out, for example, on the manufacturing side or the industrial production side in Germany. So plenty to talk about this morning. Of course, our top story still remains the race for the White House. It is still essentially too close to call. Counting continues in crucial swing states, with Joe Biden catching up with President Trump in Georgia and in Pennsylvania, and extending his lead in Nevada. Both candidates spoke earlier.
It's really destroyed our system. It's a corrupt system, and it makes people corrupt even if they aren't by nature, but they become corrupt. It's too easy.
We continue to feel, Senator and I, we continue to feel very good about where things stand. We have no doubt that when the count is finished, Senator Harris and I will be declared the winners. So I ask everyone to stay calm, all the people to stay calm. The process is working. The count is being completed, and we'll know very soon.
The call there to stay calm from Joe Biden, to stay calm and to stay patient. So we were talking earlier with our colleague on the Markets Live blog, saying traders just want to make it to the weekend from a market perspective, of course. But let's get back to the overall politics. Trump took no questions after the news conference. We just played you a clip of it there. He was referencing what he calls voter fraud, but Bloomberg News, our team, finds no evidence of widespread illegal voting in this election. Joining us now, Bloomberg reporter Ed Ludlow in California with the latest on this race. Take us through where this race stands at this point then, Ed.
Yeah, so in terms of electoral college votes, Joe Biden, by Bloomberg's count, has 264. And I'm taking a close look at Georgia because in the last half an hour, the race there has really narrowed. Trump is up just 665 votes with around 5 million counted. But we know more votes are still to come from key counties which are Democrat leaning. You know, this is really a story of Joe Biden taking advantage of mail-in ballots in city areas, urban areas like Atlanta, like Savannah, where he is hitting around 70%, 80% of the vote in terms of ballots that are being returned. A very similar story in Pennsylvania, where again, the gap the lead that Trump holds over Biden has narrowed to around 18,000 votes. Philadelphia is playing a very key role here, and it's a similar story to one that I just outlined, where a very high proportion of the ballot that's being returned is going in favor of the Democrats. Very quickly and interestingly on Georgia, yes, the driver right now is counties like Clayton County. That is the home, or was the home, of the late Congressman John Lewis. But earlier in the evening, Biden seemed to be picking up counties that voted for Trump in 2016 or were projected to vote for Trump in this election. That in case of Georgia, we're also, of course, thinking about Nevada, but don't expect any vote to come from, or an updated vote count to come from Nevada until sometime tomorrow.
And what about Arizona? Because we've included in the overall numbers that you went through there, we've included Arizona under Joe Biden, because two of the networks in the United States have, but not all of the networks have. And there does seem to still be some confusion over what is happening there.
Yeah, so Fox News first and then the Associated Press called Arizona in favor of Biden very early on election night, with a modest amount of the vote actually counted. The Trump campaign pushed back very quickly. They still believe that Trump can win in Arizona. Biden has a lead of around 2% statewide. But in Maricopa County, which accounts for 60% of Arizona's electorate, he has been chipping away at Joe Biden's lead. Now, there are about 300,000 ballots outstanding in Arizona statewide, 200,000 in Maricopa County, but sources on both sides tell me they still feel that those ballots, which are principally mail-in ballots that were returned prior to the election or on election day, are going to be skewed towards the Democrats. This is a state in which Democrats put a lot of money into in terms of fundraising, advertising, because they felt that they could take across the ballot a share from the Republican Party, but it has long been a Republican-held state, and the Trump campaign is doing all it can to keep that alive, even though two news outlets have called it in favor of Biden.
Let me ask you about the Senate race as well, Ed, because this is crucially important to investors, actually. We, of course, focus very much on the White House race, but the extent to which the president, the future president, will be supported by the Senate is crucial. I thought 48 hours ago, or I'm losing track of days, some time ago, it seemed as if the Senate maybe was not going to go to the Democrats, but now things seem to be incredibly close there, and we're going to be kept waiting a while.
So there is a chance, and a big part of that story is Georgia, where two Senate races will go to a runoff in January. The Democrats have done very well. They picked up a seat in Colorado, and I don't mean to keep coming back to Arizona, but as things stand, if Biden and the Democrats can hold on in Arizona, they will return two senators to Washington for the first time since the 1950s. And you think about one of the candidates there, Mark Kelly, a Democrat, a former astronaut. He really positioned himself as a centrist and talked about being able to work across the aisle. And that seemed to have a really positive effect across the ballot in terms of attracting independent vote and some Republican vote to vote for Biden as well in the Democratic Party. But they've not been able to replicate that elsewhere. Yes, they picked up Colorado and Arizona, but they lost a seat in Alabama. So why they have this path in the Senate, a potential path through the runoff in Georgia, it's still looking very difficult. And then you look at the popular vote. Yes, almost 74 million people have voted for Joe Biden in this election, but almost 70 million people have also voted for Donald Trump. And a lot of officials going into this week told me that this was being positioned as a referendum on Donald Trump. But there's still support for him there. And if you look at the balance on the two chambers, it seems like it's going to be pretty difficult as it stands in terms of governance for Joe Biden, if indeed he does become president-elect.
Yeah, and crucially there, of course, if we do end up in a tie in the Senate, eventually the VP, the Vice President, would have that tiebreaker role. Fascinating times. We'll keep watching. Ed, thank you very much. Bloomberg reporter Ed Ludlow. Now, let's get a market perspective. Peter Chatwell, Mizuho International Head of Multi-Asset Strategy, joins us now. Peter, really good to speak to you. Are you brave enough to have a base case at this point that covers not just the White House or the Senate? What are you working with?
Well, markets have been pricing the Biden win since about 10 a.m. on Wednesday. That was a time when Michigan really swung in Biden's favor. And so then I think myself and the market generally has been extrapolating that and assuming that there's a divided government led by Biden. So then the main question is, what does this mean for risk assets and its upside? There's upside for risk assets really because of this is a pretty benign government that's going to be there, unlikely to do much. And so markets can work with that. A government that can't do much, actually, that's not a bad thing then. We understand that. It just means that there's unlikely to be the big fiscal package that the market was getting so excited about over the past few weeks. But it's likely to be replaced if and when needed by a more dovish Fed than was previously assumed. So,
yeah,
you know,
how is the market managing to get
hikes.
over that? Yes. How is the market managing to get over that disappointment, though, about the fiscal package so quickly? The market narrative seemed quite attached to that fiscal gift some time ago, Peter, and now the market has quickly cast that aside.
Yeah. So with that respect, it's really about substitution from the Fed. And you've seen that happen. That's why the Treasury curve has gone that bit lower and flatter. And then I think what we've also had, a lot of this rally from about 32.50 on the S&P 500 up to 3,500 has been a pricing out of uncertainty. So, you know, a buy on the facts type of mentality. It's not suggesting that there is an enormous amount of upside after that. We've really got to be thinking that this is the fog clearing, and that's what the market reaction has been. And it allows then the market to think about, with that uncertainty out of the way, then it allows the market to think about what happens next year. I think a lot of strategists, ourselves included, we're thinking about what's going to happen next year. How much growth is there? You know, when growth in our expectation is going to be extraordinary in Q2 of next year, that's going to be the point when risk assets have, I think, a real sparkling quarter of performance. And markets can look through that and think, okay, maybe valuations are high at the moment, but next year, early next year, they're likely to be putting money to work in risk assets, and equities will continue their ascent. So there may be a pause now at 3,500. It looks to be a near-term technical resistance, and perhaps non-farm payrolls today can also stop equities in the tracks in the near term. But next year looks like it's going to be very supportive.
Non-farm payrolls. A nice reminder that we need to focus back on the US economy, Peter, lest we forget. And of course, the Fed meeting of yesterday, very interesting too. Speaking of the Fed was talking about the need for fiscal stimulus. And to some people, some of the words that were used by Jay Powell suggested that there would be more to come on the monetary side. How did you interpret the Fed?
Yeah, so the Fed really opened the doors to all options. When there is uncertainty about the political side, then there clearly is uncertainty about what can be delivered on the fiscal side. And if the fiscal side is delayed or much smaller than would be optimal from a macroeconomic perspective, then the Fed will I think, inevitably step in to do more. And they've talked about how they can do more. They can increase QE or their corporate bond purchases, or indeed that they can look further out the curve if they really need to. With mortgage rates at record lows, we don't think they need to be going further out the curve at this time. But yeah, the options are all open there. The Fed has an immense ability to act. And the fact that they're able to lay out all these options is another one of the reasons why risk assets are still supported in the medium term and in the long term to the upside.
Okay, Peter, thank you very much. Stay with us. Peter Chatwell, Mizuho International, head of multi-asset strategy, does stay with us, and he's talking there about risk assets being supported, and they weren't when I came into work a few hours ago in terms of the day session story, but they are increasingly supported this morning. So Dow futures pairing losses actually turning almost positive. Nasdaq futures now down just 0.4%. The stock story here in Europe is that we've got European equity markets up by 0.2%. FTSE 100 up by 0.3%, so some decent gains, or not exceptional, but some moves to the upside at least coming through. We're also seeing some selling of treasuries and yields going a little bit higher, which makes a change from a few hours ago. Oil pairing earlier losses. That's a look then at where we are on the markets. We will come back shortly with further analysis of the fight against COVID-19 and the effect of that on markets. This is Bloomberg. European market open 15 minutes into the European equity trading session, and things looking actually more positive than maybe we'd anticipated. The DAX now fairly flat, the CAC 40 and the FTSE 100 keeping their heads above water. We sort of had a lackluster trading session through Asia markets, risk assets losing their nerve just a little bit, and we saw that with Nasdaq futures down around 1% earlier on, but those losses now being paired. Nasdaq futures down 0.6%, and let's not forget that, of course, we've seen a very strong rally in risk assets in the earlier part of this week. The Bloomberg Dollar Index pretty much unchanged, which might come as a relief for some who were watching that take on a great degree of volatility a couple of days ago. Peter Chatwell, Mizuho International Head of Multi-Asset Strategy, is still with us. In the immediate aftermath of voting day, we still seem to be in the election, don't we, Peter? But the immediate aftermath of voting day, we did see the dollar gain strength, as it seemed that some of those trades around Biden's success were unwound a little bit. Where do you see the path of the US dollar from here?
I see it firmly going to the downside, with the exception just being any moments of geopolitical risk, possible flare-ups on that side. But I think if we do get Joe Biden confirmed as the next president as well, the prospect of there being geopolitical flare-ups will diminish significantly over the next 4 years. So look, on the dollar, we're firmly bearish. With regards levels, we see the euro rising to 130 against the dollar for June of next year. Similar for other major crosses. So it really is that next year, with the geopolitical risks reducing, and really with the global economy going back into a cyclical upswing, then the downside to the dollar is really very significant. It means that you're going to struggle, if you're a foreign investor, to make money by investing in dollar assets unless you hedge those FX risks.
Okay.
So that's where we see major opportunities outside of dollars.
Okay, so that's the dollar story for you. Of course, the pound and the euro have really been flipped around by the dollar this week, haven't they? It's been very much a dollar story, very much focused on the US election. But there are other things going on this week, not least of which the news we got from the Bank of England this week, and also from the UK Chancellor. Let's just listen to the Bank of England governor giving his thoughts on some of the risks.
I think we've learned this year from our experiences with earlier bouts of COVID that it's important that we act both quickly and that we do act clearly in scale. We've got a very substantial downside risk on the forecast, and a lot of that relates to how COVID itself is going to evolve.
Andrew Bailey there, the Governor of the Bank of England, speaking to us this week about what they've been doing, the scale of the action they've been taking. Peter, what kind of, if you do see the dollar downtrend, does that mean that the pound has some support from that? Of course, there's plenty of other news around the pound, the Brexit trade negotiation deadlines approaching, and also what we heard, quite big news actually in Parliament yesterday from Rishi Sunak, the Chancellor, extending the furlough scheme to March.
Yeah, I would much rather buy the euro or the yen rather than the pound. So the pound, I think, is still going to struggle. I think that when we look at the UK economy in the first quarter of next year, it's really going to be a laggard compared to the euro and compared to the US economy. The reason I think it's going to be a laggard is that we're going to be struggling to rebalance the economy. I think really for the economy to rebalance and to adjust to the new trading environment with the EU and other partners, then really what's necessary is a weaker pound for that adjustment to really accelerate. So I think the underperformance from the UK economy versus its major peers is going to be really quite pronounced in the first half of next year. And then it's only after a period of weak pound that we do get a rebalancing of the economy, and then we see some upside. So still, unfortunately, I think sterling assets are going to be underperforming, with the exception of gilts. I would think that gilts are going to be performing quite well in currency neutral terms, as an overly dovish continues to surprise the market. An overly dovish Bank of England continues to surprise the market, and ultimately we would expect that the gilt curve can fall flatten significantly even from current levels.
Peter, thank you very much. Apologies for a bit of sound interference we were just getting there. Peter Chatwell, thanks so much for your time. Mizuho International Head of Multi-Asset Strategy. Let's get up to date on the latest on the election. Then no change still in the overall numbers that we're talking about here. The 264 for Biden, the 214 for Trump. That is if you count Arizona under the column for former Vice President Biden. This is still then the race to 270, of course. We'll keep across the counts in a number of swing states that are still ongoing. In particular, Georgia, we're getting ongoing updates from the counts in Georgia. We'll get up to date with that shortly for you. This is Bloomberg. The European market open 23 minutes into a trading session that looks increasingly positive as we continue to watch a drip feed of results coming through from Georgia, where counting is ongoing. Other states still counting, of course, Nevada, Pennsylvania, and others. But we do seem to have more movement on the Georgia number, and the lead that President Trump there has seems to be decreasing as more votes are counted. That is the state of play right now as we race towards 270. Joe Biden, it seems, 6 electoral college votes away. Still, same picture as this time yesterday. Now, the US has become the first country to top 100,000 cases of coronavirus in a 24-hour period. In Europe, France is warning of a violent second wave, and Italy, along with Greece, are the latest countries to impose lockdown measures. For more, Maria Tadeo joins us from Brussels. More restrictions then kicking in various parts of Europe. Maria, what are the fears around the European economy then at this point?
Well, Anna, there's a few, and actually, if you look at the numbers that came out by the European Commission yesterday, they see a bigger contraction than expected in the summer. They look at the pickup in 2021, 2022. It's not big enough to take Europe into a V-shaped recovery. And frankly, when you look at the lag between the collection of some of that data and the new restrictions, these projections don't really tell you much. So there is a real concern about a double-dip recession taking hold in Europe, especially if we do see those lockdowns being extended in time, which is a very real possibility. If you look at what Emmanuel Macron has repeated over the past few days and weeks, is that this is a situation that could last until Christmas, but could be extended. It really depends on the pandemic, and we have no visibility on that. What I would say, however, is that officials behind the scenes do tell you that they hope that a combination of action by the European Central Bank, that recovery fund being operational in 2021, could save the day for Europe. But national governments need to continue to spend. The problem here is that not every country has the same amount of money to spend to protect their economies.
And what about the money that's been set aside in the recovery fund then, Maria? The EU cut a preliminary deal over rule of law yesterday, which had been holding up, of course, some of the agreement around that recovery fund. What are you seeing there?
Yes, Anna, look, it's a preliminary deal. Nothing is agreed until everything is agreed, but it is a significant step. We know that had been a major stumbling block. There's a number of other issues that still need to be approved, but if anything, there is momentum going on for this recovery fund to be operational by the start of next year, for the money to flow in the second half of 2021. If anything, the second round of coronavirus has really increased the pressure on the European Parliament to be able to deliver a deal and get to an agreement quickly.
Okay, Maria, thanks very much. Maria Tadeo in Brussels. The US election then still too close to call. More on the White House race next. European equity markets actually just losing their momentum now this morning, down 0.2% on the stock 600. US futures point lower. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back to the European Market Open. 30 minutes into our trading session here in Europe. We're nearly there. We're nearly through Friday. Well, no, not nearly through Friday, nearly through the week. Stocks Europe 600 then just dropping by 0.1%. The US election still too close to call. In fact, the overall numbers look exactly the same as they did this time yesterday. Trump on 214, Biden, including Arizona, on 264. The race for the White House is still too close to call. Counting continues in crucial swing states, with Joe Biden catching up with President Trump in Georgia and in Pennsylvania and extending his lead in Nevada. Both candidates spoke earlier.
It's really destroyed our system. It's a corrupt system, and it makes people corrupt even if they aren't by nature, but they become corrupt. It's too easy.
We continue to feel, Senator and I, we continue to feel very good about where things stand. We have no doubt that when the count is finished, Senator Harris and I will be declared the winners. So I ask everyone to stay calm, all the people to stay calm. The process is working. The count is being completed, and we'll know very soon.
President Trump took no questions after the news conference that you saw just there, and I should say that Bloomberg News reports there is no evidence of widespread illegal voting in the election. Joining us now is our senior international editor, Jody Schneider. Jody, what is the latest then on the counting, on the race to 270?
Well, Joe Biden looks to be significantly ahead. Even if you don't count Arizona, which not all the networks have counted, the AP and Fox have put it in his camp, but not everyone has. He has 253 electoral college votes. President Trump has 213. So if Joe Biden got Arizona, he would only need one of the following: Pennsylvania, Georgia, or Nevada. For President Trump, if he doesn't get Arizona, which it looks like he won't at this point, he needs all of those plus North Carolina. So it's a much easier path to victory for Joe Biden at this point, to that 270 critical number for the Electoral College vote. They're continuing to count. We hear that we could hear as soon as tomorrow, as soon as Friday in the U.S. time, about Nevada or Georgia. It looks like it's going to take longer in Pennsylvania, where they had a surge in mail-in votes, and that is what is taking so long to count, particularly in urban areas like Philadelphia.
Right, so that gives us a little bit of a clue on the timing here, Jody, but expand on that if you could. And we're just looking at live pictures of Philadelphia, where there doesn't seem to be a great deal happening at this point. Oh, I can see people moving in the background there. Counting continues, of course, 11:33 a.m. in Philadelphia. Let's flip the conversation, though, to Georgia, where the narrowing gap the narrowing lead that President Trump has in Georgia is crucially important, really interesting to watch. Of course, we have 16 electoral college votes available in Georgia. The percentages here look the same, but the lead we understand that President Trump now has in Georgia is only 665 votes. This is down to 3 digits here, and as they continue to count in Georgia, things increasingly move in Joe Biden's favor.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm placing an order to sell short Japanese yen at 103.495. 103.495. Okay, order placed.
I don't think it's coming in the next 2 hours, probably more in the U.S. day when they can finish that counting and certify those counts. We've been thinking it could have been in the past day for Georgia or Nevada. Pennsylvania, again, is going to take longer. Their rules there and their system makes it seem like that could be days away. But if this lead, if that lead for President Trump continues to dwindle, and we've seen that significantly in the past few days, Joe Biden could take that state. Again, the way this works is the people who voted in person on election day, those votes were counted first. That seemed to favor Republicans. The president had maligned mail-in voting for a long time, told his supporters to show up on election day, and many of them did. And so those votes were kind of first, and it looked like he led in a number of places where once those mail-in ballots came in, his lead dwindled significantly. And in places like Michigan and Wisconsin, he ended up losing. that could well happen in Georgia, which would be a big political move. Georgia has long been a red state. It has just gone for a Democratic president 3 times in relatively modern history, twice of them to Jimmy Carter, who is obviously from there.
Excellent. Thanks very much for the update and all the context. Jody, thank you. Senior International Editor Jody Schneider with the latest on the race as a whole and the specifics there around Georgia. Joining us now for an economic perspective on all of this, Callum Pickering, Berenberg Senior Economist, joins us now. Callum, what are your expectations for fiscal stimulus in the US? I talked to a guest from UBS earlier on who was saying that under a blue wave scenario, they were thinking something like $3 trillion for the US economy in that scenario. And if you end up with sort of shared power in Washington, a constrained Biden presidency, perhaps, then you end up with something that's much smaller than that, maybe a sixth, below $1 trillion. What are your expectations for the fiscal impulse in the US?
That sounds fairly reasonable. Of course, we have to speculate about what the result will be. So if we work on the basis that Biden wins the presidency, but then Congress remains split with the Republicans still in control, only by 1 or 2 in the Senate, then you don't get the big stimulus that would have come with the blue wave. Now, in the near term, markets may be a little bit unhappy about that, but I would just emphasize that the US, even running into the coronavirus pandemic, was running very significant deficits. So any additional borrowing to fuel the fiscal stimulus over the next couple of years would then have to be corrected with some significant austerity, say 3-4 years down the line, in the form of either spending cuts or higher taxes. So I don't think the way to look at it is whether or not the fiscal impulse is smaller, but whether or not the cycle of fiscal policy will be flatter under a mixed Congress. And I think over, say, a 5 or 6 year view, we're probably better off with the mixed Congress, because you won't get the boom followed by the bust, which is induced essentially by the big fiscal splurge followed by some corrective tax hikes.
And would you expect the Fed to step in instead and to do more of something if we see less on the fiscal side?
Well, there's only really so much the Fed can do. The Fed can promise to keep rates lower for longer. It can try to raise inflation expectations. It already basically has QE infinity in the US. So it's tough to know exactly what the Fed can do. The Fed's making sure there's liquidity. Anyone that needs loanable funds in the US, be it households, firms that are struggling, they can get the credit they need. So the Fed is largely doing its job. Monetary policy in that sense actually has some limits. It can provide the cash, but then someone has to borrow it and spend it, which is why fiscal policy matters so much. I would just emphasize too that the US, from a cyclical position, is actually a bit closer to what you might describe as full employment relative to Europe. So as far as we can tell, the US by early 2021, on the current track of the recovery, will be reaching Q4 2019 pre-pandemic levels of GDP. So I think there is actually a justifiable question to say, does the US really need a big fiscal stimulus? Of course, the markets would like it, but probably the recovery is sufficiently strong anyway.
Can I ask you about unemployment in the US? We're going to get the jobs report a little bit later on today. The unemployment rate prediction from Bloomberg Economics is to have edged down to 7.7%. I wonder how difficult it is during this particular crisis to work out what impact an unemployment rate has on an economy based on the amount of unprecedented support that is coming from various governments.
That's exactly right. I mean, it's a tough question to answer, because what typically happens in a recession is unemployment surges as economic output drops, and that severely impacts household spending capacity because income falls as unemployment rises. That's not happened this time around in the US or across Europe, because governments have transferred huge sums to households either through direct transfers in the US or through generous employment subsidies in Europe. So even as economic output has fallen and the number of hours worked or employment has dropped, household income has actually increased in major parts of the world, especially in the US. So what we're likely to see is households spend this cash over the next few months, and that should accelerate the employment recovery, which so far has been pretty good in the US. I think this is actually a fairly good recipe for future recessions. Transfer income to households, offset that usual income fall, and you can pretty much guarantee a decent recovery as households spend that cash.
Yeah, really interesting. And of course, we should acknowledge that there's going to be a great deal of variation around that average experience, which you point to there in the US or globally. Callum, thanks so much. Callum Pickering, Berenberg senior economist, joining us there with the latest economic take, if you like, on the US election. Up next, equities limp towards the end of the week as investors watch the tight race to determine the next American president. We'll analyse the market reaction to the vote count next. This is Bloomberg. Market open 43 minutes into Europe's trading session, and European equity markets faltering just a little, down by 0.4% or so in Paris and in Frankfurt. We have US futures actually pointing modestly to the downside. Nasdaq futures, though, have been more negative than the others. They're down about 0.75% this hour. That in the context of strong gains earlier on this week. Now, as investors monitor a tight race, stocks notched up the biggest post-election surge in modern history. Those equity gains have paused this morning, as that graphic just showed, as votes continue to be tallied in a handful of key US states. Joining us to discuss is Bloomberg's Danny Berger. Danny, good morning again. So what has been driving the positivity that up until this morning has sort of ruled on the equity story globally?
It's almost sort of a comfort trade, Anna. Markets settling back into what they knew was reliable. The wild thing about the past 3 days worth of gains is the average stock actually fell. Most stocks were not participating in this rally. Again, I say it's a return to what's comfortable. That is big momentum back. FANGs leading the charge, mega cap tech. That's what all of this.
I have to remove the order to sell short. Japanese yen has just moved away from my order. I'll wait for another time.
Investors now, again, it's back to that Fed put. At the same time, we saw the dollar move lower, bond yields as well. it's just that lower for longer trade really coming back. So despite election uncertainty, us saying markets hate uncertainty, they went to what was comfortable. Now, in terms of what's happening today, look, it's Friday, huge week of gains, a lot of uncertainty heading into the weekend. Maybe it makes sense, take some risk off the table and go get some much needed sleep, Anna.
Yeah, absolutely. Everybody needs a rest over the weekend. I wonder if we'll get one. Danny, thank you very much. Danny Berger with the latest on the markets. Just a quick update. That gap between President Trump, who is still in the lead in Georgia, and former Vice President Biden, who is trailing him just slightly. That lead for President Trump is constantly, it seems, being eroded by the continuation of counting that is going on in Georgia. That count continues, and we keep getting updated numbers. So we'll keep you up to date with the extent of the lead that President Trump has there. They have actually counted almost all of the votes there now, so we'll see where that one ends up. Elizabeth Braw, American Enterprise Institute Fellow, joins us now. Elizabeth, very good to speak to you. I wonder how closely you're watching things in Georgia, or if not Georgia, where are you focused in the early hours of the US morning, or the 8:45 hour here in London? Where's your focus?
Well, I think we're all watching Georgia, and it was interesting the other day. Actually, yesterday there was a cartoon in a Russian newspaper that showed two little old ladies in Siberia discussing the various counties, and so that's where we are now. Everybody is turning into an observer of counties in Georgia, Wisconsin, Arizona, and so forth. And yeah, Georgia is decisive. It would be obviously a huge shift or a huge win for Biden if he managed to win Georgia, which was expected to go Trump's way. But it's interesting, all over the world, I think we're all watching little counties that ordinarily nobody cares about.
Right, indeed, and we'll have to see whether, if the numbers stay so tight in Georgia, whether a recount is requested, as it has been done by the Trump campaign in other places. What do you think is President Trump's strategy here, Elizabeth? Because he keeps suggesting that illegality has taken place. Bloomberg News and many other news outlets point to no evidence of widespread voter fraud taking place in America. What do you think is the strategy? Is it that he really wants that to be something he wins with in court, or is it just he's setting up how he's going to approach the next few months or after this election?
So I think there are two things. I think his first strategy is to delay, and we have to remember that there is a cutoff date by which all the states have to announce their results, and some states that are still counting, if the result is not clear by that date, and if the date comes and no result is clear, then those states could simply appoint the electors themselves. And if it's a Republican-ruled states, they could just say, well, we'll appoint Republican voting electors, or electors who will vote for Trump in the Electoral College. So it's really, really dangerous. So essentially, the popular vote could be lost. And I think that's what he's going for. It's playing with fire, but we have to remember that there is no legal obligation for the states to go with the popular vote. The Constitution just says they will appoint electors for their state, and it has been the practice so far that they went with the popular vote. But if the popular vote is unclear, or if it's just very narrow, if the count hasn't been concluded by that date, then they may just decide to appoint Electoral College members who will vote for Trump on behalf of their states.
Right, and so that link between the popular vote, the link between the popular vote within a state and the Electoral College votes, does that vary state by state, or is that nationwide that there is this lack of clarity?
Well, it's different in different states, but I think that the reality now is that it's only a few states that matter. But then another thing that is important to bear in mind is that if Trump concedes and he won't do so willingly, but if there's no way forward for him, even through the courts, then he has 4 years where he will. He's likely to create a lot of mischief for Biden, and we are already hearing suggestions that if he has to step down, he's planning to run again in 2024. So you can imagine what it will be like for U.S. political stability, for Biden in particular, and for the American efforts to at least try to heal the country if he sits on the sidelines and sort of makes his opinions known over the next few years, should he lose.
Yeah, perhaps through his own media outlet. That's been much talked about, hasn't it? Elizabeth, thank you very much. Elizabeth Braw, American Enterprise Institute Fellow, thank you very much. We keep focusing in on that ever diminishing lead that President Trump does still have, it seems, in Georgia, and asking questions about where this count goes next. We'll bring you the latest as we get it. This is Bloomberg. Back to the European market open. European markets in limbo, global equity markets in limbo, the world in limbo, waiting for the results of the race to the White House. It's still too close to call. Let's get a check on the vote counts in the key battlegrounds. Anne-Marie Hordern has a breakdown. Anne-Marie.
And as you say, still too close to call. Right now, what we have is 264 for former Vice President Joe Biden. If you include Arizona, which Fox and AP have called, and then 214, you can see in red there, for the President of the United States. I want to drill down to what's going on in Georgia. This has become an absolute dead heat race. We have what CNN is calling the margin of error is just spectacular. You can see here 49.4% versus 49.4%. But CNN has President Donald Trump leading by 463 votes. You don't see that in a presidential race. Quite frankly, maybe you'd only see that in your university student council. But that is how close we are seeing in Georgia. And if quickly we have Pennsylvania, the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania is 20 electoral votes. Those counts are coming in. A lot of these are mail-in ballots, and they've been skewing towards former Vice President Joe Biden. Right now, 49.3% versus 49.6%. We are still waiting for a number of those to come out. What is so important about Pennsylvania is there is no path for the president for another 4 years without those 20 electoral votes. And if former Vice President Joe Biden was able to clinch Pennsylvania, then the game is over, Anna, and he's the President of the United States.
Anne-Marie, thanks very much. Anne-Marie Hordern joining us there with the latest then on the race. Let's get the market perspective. Ven Ram, Bloomberg Markets Live Currency and Rate Strategist, is with us. Ven, we've seen the dollar on the move a lot, and that's got a lot of my attention this week. I haven't been thinking quite so much about the yen, but I know you have, and I know you have thoughts on where the yen goes from here. What are you seeing?
I think the yen is eminently poised to close in on 100 parity against the dollar, primarily because of the inflows that we are seeing. If you look at Japanese stocks, they have surged to a 29-year high, and that's unusual. And obviously, that is surging. That is causing fund flows into Japan to surge. But as the gains in the yen approach $100, I think the BOJ may get a bit antsy about it because they do not want to choke off economic activity that may stem from strength in the yen, undue strength in the yen, Anna.
Yeah, and when we think about the election results, still pending, of course, which assets are complacent, do you think, then, on the vote outcome? I know the Markets Live team have been asking this question and taking soundings.
I think that the stocks are pretty rich at current valuations. We are looking at earnings yield of about 3.5%, and that's historically not been a sustainable level for stocks. And the same goes for treasuries as well. The long-dated treasuries are pretty rich after this week's curve flattening, and I think that that stasis may continue for the reasons that Anne-Marie mentioned just now, for maybe a couple of more weeks until this uncertainty plays out. But after that, I think that investors will come back probably in the new year and relook valuations in stocks and long-dated treasuries. Anna?
Ben, thanks so much. Ben Rahm, Bloomberg's Markets Live currency and rate strategist, joining us this Friday morning. That is it for the European Market Open. Stay with Bloomberg Television. Surveillance will be up next. They'll be taking you through all of the results as they continue to come in particular from Georgia. The race to 270 continues. 264 for Biden, including Arizona. 214 for President Trump. We'll see where this gets over the next few hours as those Georgia numbers, as I say, continue to come through. President Trump's lead there narrowing. Also watching what's going on in Pennsylvania. Here we have live pictures for you of Philadelphia, I think, Philadelphia, where the counting continues. This is Bloomberg.
Down to the wire, just hundreds of votes separate President Trump and Joe Biden in Georgia. Pennsylvania remains too close to call. As Joe Biden appears to pull ahead, the president says the election is being stolen despite no evidence of widespread illegal voting. And Jay Powell says it's a good time to let the institutions of democracy do their job. The Fed says the virus will weigh on the economy as U.S. daily cases top 100,000. Well, good morning once again, everyone, and welcome to our special 2020 election coverage. It's, of course, day 3. Someone put it to me very nicely. It's all nice to stay up all together if you think the world is really riveted by what's happening in the vote counting in the U.S. I'm Francine Lacqua. I'm in London. Tom Keene, as always, of course, in New York. Tom, interesting to look at market movements, but really the world is watching this razor-thin election, just trying to, understand why it's taking so long in certain, counties and states to count these votes, and of course trying to find out what happens in the Senate race and what happens with the president.
And what will happen on this Friday, Francine? It's going to be extraordinary this Friday, and the uncertainty of where we are Friday afternoon, where we are into the weekend. One thing I think that's very evident is we edge towards recounts, which will move us nicely through November and even into December. One telling statistic, Francine, the sum right now of the 5 states, forget about Alaska, the 5-state disparity between these two candidates is 153,919 votes out of 143 million that have been made.
Yeah, really incredible, Tom. I mean, we're talking about razor-thin changes, and still we understand, of course, that the latest electoral vote count for the moment, Biden 264, Trump 214. This is what the markets are doing. Now, we did see a rally over the last few days. Tom, that rally is slowly fading away. Now, I was looking at some of the emerging market bond yields, and if you can see the spread between treasuries and some of those emerging market bond yields actually narrowing. Overall, the figure I want to show you in terms of what we're looking at in the data is gold pretty much unchanged. There's nothing huge in the markets today, Tom, as the vote counting continues. And so this global equity rally showing signs of easing, the dollar holding to a 2-year low. And if you look at some of the other things, you can see gold flat and crude oil declining slightly, Tom.
Very interesting to see this. Alan Ruskin on the Fed show yesterday afternoon of Deutsche Bank, I thought was just lights out about the currency dynamics. It is our deepest market worldwide. It is the one that gives us the most information tick by tick. And on the Bloomberg, it's simple. Sustained weaker dollar this morning. One of the great shifts I see so far, Francine, is that euro 118.40. What a rebound off the 116 level. And more than anything, the acceleration yesterday, Francine, of strong yen. The bid of the yen right now a 103.48, blowing through a 104 level. It was just a sight to behold yesterday. Some stability this morning.
Yeah, we'll have plenty more, of course, on Euro dynamics. Now, the race for the White House is still too close to call. Counting continues in crucial swing states, with Joe Biden catching up with President Trump in Georgia and Pennsylvania. Now, Biden currently trails by just 463 votes in Georgia. Now, for all of the latest, let's get to Derek Wallbank, our senior editor. Derek, thank you for joining us. If you look at the states that are still in play, Arizona, Georgia, North Carolina, Nevada, and Pennsylvania, first of all, which are the ones that we could have more of a clearer idea on who wins in the next hour or so?
Well, Francine, Georgia seems like that's going to be very, very soon. I mean, you could be talking by sunrise in the East Coast of the United States that you will see Joe Biden take a nominal lead in that state. I asked Pennsylvania Lieutenant Governor John Fetterman when he thought that Pennsylvania was going to flip to a Biden nominal lead. His answer to me was, quote, inevitably. There's a lot of blue vote out in Pennsylvania, a little blue vote out in Georgia, and not much red on the board in either state. So it looks like for the time being, both of those are trending towards being at least a nominal lead for Joe Biden before you get to military votes coming in, as well as potential recount territory.
Derek, you're a great Washington observer. Inside the Beltway, how will the Republican combine react to the president's comments last night?
I'm seeing a lot of people who are coming into Congress honestly, who are backing him either explicitly or to some degree. You're getting very few actual repudiations from people coming in. Tom, one data point I think you'll find interesting: Will Hurd, the Texas congressman who's leaving, castigated Trump, but Tommy Tuberville, the senator who's going to come in from Alabama, linked right back up with him. You're seeing a fair bit of that dynamic. A lot of the strongest Republican voices against Trump don't have a title.
Derek, thanks so much. Derek Wellbank, there, our senior editor, looking at the U.S. elections. Now let's get plenty more, of course, on this, historic U.S. election. With more analysis, our next guest is former Deputy Chief of Mission to the U.S. Embassy in London, now senior partner at Signum Global Advisors. Lou Lukens, welcome to the program. Luke, when you look at, all of the dynamics, something that we haven't really focused on but seems significant is how will the Republican Party deal with the latest comments from President Trump yesterday, saying that actually this is a rigged election, where we have absolutely no proof of that?
Well, I think we're seeing a split in the Republican Party leadership, and some senators and leaders have come out in support of President Trump. But I think some of the more cautious members, including, I think, Mitch McConnell, will start distancing themselves from Trump, especially as the day goes on. And I think as Georgia flips to the Democratic column, and Pennsylvania too, as well as Arizona and Nevada, and it becomes clear that Joe Biden will have won this election, I think the Republican Party, certainly the more serious members of the senior leadership, will start looking to the future and trying to figure out how they can rebuild the party in a post-Trump era.
Lou, the latest electoral college vote count is Joe Biden 264, Donald Trump 214. How many recounts are we going to get? Even if we have some kind of announcement of someone getting to 270 today, are you going to be very cautious for the next couple of weeks until we deal with the legal challenges, until we deal with possible recounts?
I think so. I mean, most states, one of the sides can request a recount if the margin of victory is within 1%. And I think for sure, if that is the case, the Trump campaign will request recounts. They've already done so in Wisconsin. And in some of these states, you can't request a recount until the results are certified at the end of November. So in a sense, this could drag on for weeks and weeks. I think the end result is somewhat inevitable, but I think the Trump campaign will do all it can to drag this out and to throw up legal blocks along the way.
What is so interesting, Louis, and I totally agree with the recount schedule into December and the right to have a recount given very narrow victories, which seems to be where we're heading. What does it do to our diplomatic projection through December and into January? How vulnerable are we right now with a unique lame duckedness?
Well, we're vulnerable in the sense that if another country, an adversary, wanted to cause trouble, now's the time to do it, because not just not only are the American people 100% focused and sort of consumed by this election and the counting, but the U.S. government is pretty much at a standstill right now. So, the longer this drags out, the worse it is for U.S. democracy. And I was texting with a friend this morning, and we were both in Senegal during the elections in 2012 there. And if the president of Senegal, who lost the election and had to stand aside for his challenger, if he had said some of the things that President Trump said last night, we would have been condemning it in the strongest possible terms as Americans, observing their election. So it puts American diplomats overseas in a bit of an awkward position when the U.S. government itself is sort of turning its back on some of the standards that we have upheld and promoted around the world for decades.
What will be the special relationship between a President Biden and a Prime Minister Johnson?
Oh, I think it'll be fine. There's a lot of talk here that Biden will be very tight with France and Germany and the European Union and turn his back a little bit on the United Kingdom. I don't see that dynamic, and I think that in some ways the United Kingdom and the United States will be much more closely aligned on some policy issues, including how to deal with Iran, how to deal with climate change, the fact that we need to deal with climate change. So I think, there might be an initial awkwardness as the two leaders get to know each other. But I think the policy realm, we will be much closer aligned, and we will come together and continue to work very closely globally.
Thank you so much for joining us. Lou Lukens there, senior partner at Signum Global Advisors. Now, coming up, we'll have plenty more on market action. We'll also have plenty more of analysis. We continue our election coverage with Jim O'Neill. He's chair of Chatham House. and former commercial secretary to the UK Treasury. He joins us next, and this is Bloomberg.
It is critically important that the markets stay open in this time, as opposed to trying to take breaks in the middle. I think that that'll just push off the situation a little bit, but actually could create other pent-up issues if you do close the markets.
It's really destroyed our system. It's a corrupt system, and it makes people corrupt even if they aren't by nature. But they become corrupt. It's too easy.
We continue to feel, Senator and I, we continue to feel very good about where things stand. We have no doubt that when the count is finished, Senator Harris and I will be declared the winners. So I ask everyone to stay calm, all the people to stay calm. The process is working. The count is being completed, and we'll know very soon.
Democratic nominee Joe Biden and President Trump as well speaking on the state of the election. Trump took no questions after that news conference. I don't know if we heard the news conference actually, but it was certainly very divisive. Bloomberg News reports there's no evidence of widespread illegal voting in the election. I think we'll come back to the comments of the president shortly. Now, joining us to talk about the election, but also the ramifications for the world and what this contested, very contested election means. Let's welcome Jim O'Neill. He's chair of Chatham House. Jim, great to have you on Bloomberg Surveillance. Tom and I are delighted to speak to you. When you look at the closeness of the race, does it actually change the way that U.S. politics will move from now on? What are the overlying long-term effects that we're underestimating right now?
So who knows is my opening comment, but I was watching the show and your previous guest before I came on, and the comments that both you and Tom were making too. I would throw in an important test, which I think is November the 21st, which is the scheduled G20 meeting hosted by Saudi Arabia. This is obviously important for many reasons, but in the COVID environment, it is particularly important for further efforts to support WHO-based initiatives on equitable distribution of treatments, therapeutics, and vaccines around the whole of the world, particularly the low-income world. And I think, from everything I hear, that a Biden-led presidency would be
a lot more supportive of a, let's call it a more rational COVID approach and a greater US involvement in such issues like the G20 and ACT-A and COVAX and what have you, as opposed to the one that under Trump has been essentially dormant. And how the other G19 react in the build-up and at that G20 meeting, I think in itself will be extremely important as to the reality of the ongoing shenanigans involving possible vote counts and all the rest of it.
That's a very good point, Jim, and something that actually we need to keep an eye on. The other thing, of course, is U.S. stimulus. Now, we don't know the winner of the
Right.
U.S. presidential race. Unclear exactly what will happen in the Senate. But are you confident that the American people will get some of the stimulus they need in the first quarter of 2021?
So just on all of that, and interested to get your reaction to this. You know, maybe it's a generational thing, but I'm of the mindset that I think a split Congress with a Democratic president would actually be pretty good for the medium to longer term economic stability of the United States, as well as for constraining the wilder elements on the two fringes of the modern tone of the Democrats and the Republicans. Which is a slightly somewhat different issue to some degree than the immediate fiscal stimulus. It would seem, obviously, a split Congress would constrain the amount of stimulus that a sort of Democratic clean sweep would give. But I think it's not clear to me, given the likely path of vaccine development, i.e. just around the corner, whether a mammoth fiscal stimulus is as necessary as many people are talking about. And I personally think a split Congress wouldn't be a bad thing.
Lord O'Neill, Tom Keene in New York, good morning to you. I don't want to throw a brick into the discussion, but let's throw a brick into the discussion, and that is
throw some.
Well, you know, I have to look at the currency movements of the last 24 hours, indeed the last 48 hours. When you look at the acceleration of yen strength, what does that signal?
So I was listening to what you were saying about that earlier, and actually I've been keeping informed via Bloomberg Radio the past 2 days. You guys have been doing a great job on all of this. And, you know, I was laughing to myself when I heard you guys getting all excited about the moves of the dollar yesterday. And having been around the foreign exchange market for 40 years, I'm like, this is nothing, guys. You know, bring it back to the real world where currencies actually move. I was brought up in days where dollar yen could move 10 big figures in a day. So,
Jim, I did the math last night with Alan Ruskin at Deutsche Bank. Let's cut to the chase. This isn't 1981, is it?
No, it's not. Listen, I think what's broadly going on here is the market's perceiving less immediate fiscal stimulus, which essentially commits the Fed, even more than the Fed has said, to a multiple period ahead of an extremely easy monetary policy. Combine that with a more cooperative president with the rest of the world, not just on equitable vaccines, but on resurrecting the G20 and let's call it being a bit more normal about international engagement. And it would all suggest an environment where the dollar should weaken. And it's pretty much what I would have thought. So I'm not surprised to see the foreign exchange market doing that yesterday. And I wouldn't be surprised, pending the hourly and daily news flow here, that we've set in train already a new sort of fiscal policy, monetary policy framework, and one that is consistent with a weaker dollar. And the next issue before we know will be at what level are the Japanese and others going to try and stop their currencies from strengthening, because otherwise dollar yen, I suspect, is on course to go through 100 and the euro is going to go through 120. And by the way, the Chinese
Jim, I'm looking at a great chart, actually.
As well.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about China, but before I wanted to ask about emerging markets as a whole, I'm looking at a great chart on the Bloomberg terminal, which basically says that, emerging market investors really looked on to load up to riskier assets, given what they know of the U.S. election so far. Will that continue?
Mm-hmm. I think so, yeah. I think if you look at the broad level of valuations, and if you link it to the kind of policy framework I've just said, unless there is... If I try to think that what could upset this, I suppose a surprising, quick and sizable uptick in US inflation that forced the Fed to behave very differently. I think without that, the environment for so-called emerging market equities is really good, because it's the one part of the investment universe that is not particularly expensive from a valuation perspective. And now we've got the whole policy thrust going their favor as well. Including, by the way, how Chinese policy is operating.
Jim, thank you so much. Jim O'Neill, the chair of Chatham House, of course, always insightful, also on emerging markets. Now, coming up, one story in town as the vote continues. Joe Biden is narrowing the gap in Pennsylvania. We'll have a full breakdown of all of the states that are still to report some of the vote counts. Arizona, Georgia, North Carolina, Nevada, and Pennsylvania still in play. This is Bloomberg.
Economic activity has continued to recover from its depressed second quarter level. The high level of joblessness has been especially severe for lower wage workers in the services sector, for women, and for African Americans and Hispanics. The economic dislocation has upended many lives and created great uncertainty about the future. The recent rise in new COVID-19 cases, both here in the United States and abroad, is particularly concerning. We expect to maintain an accommodative stance of monetary policy until these employment and inflation outcomes are achieved. You talk to banks and they'll say demand for loans is very, very low right now. Companies are not borrowing. When I say we're not out of ammo, I'm looking at a couple of our tools mainly. As I mentioned, the asset purchase program, there's a number of dimensions in which we can adjust that if we deem it to be appropriate. Right now, we like the job it's doing. But I think we'll have a stronger recovery if we can just get at least some more fiscal support when it's appropriate, when it's appropriate and the size Congress thinks it's appropriate. It's a good time to take a step back and let the institutions of our democracy do their jobs.
Chair Jay Powell there opening the door to a possible shift in central banks' bond purchases, saying more fiscal and monetary support, of course, is needed. Tom, as we see the second wave also in the U.S., we'll have a look at U.S. jobs and hiring dynamics.
Well, it'll be interesting to say the least. And again, we've got the election returns coming in this morning. Next, Ambassador Gardner, Anthony Gardner will join us. This is Bloomberg. Good morning.
Another day of risk off across the financial markets. We bring you special coverage of all the price action and implications here on Bloomberg Television.
I was actually poor.
No foreplay?
Eat your bag of Lay's with a smile on your face.
If all the diseases have been taken, I'll take a tax.
Bloomberg Surveillance Summit Francine for this U.S. election special. Tom, it's 4 a.m., 4:20 actually in New York, and what we need to do is have a look exactly at state by state, the ones that could flip, how close the race is. I know we spent a lot of time in the last couple of weeks looking at Georgia, Tom. Georgia, we understand through certain counts of the Associated Press, could have flipped. I know we've all become experts, even if we live internationally, about the counties within, of course, the state of Georgia. Clayton County, we understand, has just updated its totals, giving the former vice president a narrow lead in Georgia. Again, Tom, we haven't closed it. There could be recounts. There's a number of things that are still wide open, but this feels significant because, of course, it's something that the markets are looking at. I don't exactly know what's priced in, if they're pricing in a possible Biden presidency, because he does seem to have the slightly upper edge right now. But certainly, Tom, that Georgia news coming in the last couple of minutes, extremely, extremely important.
Widely anticipated, and again, for our international audience, this is a state with an extraordinary history, as all of our states actually are. This is a state in 1968 that voted for George Wallace, who was hugely controversial, and of course that wrapped around racial issues. It is a state that was devotedly Democratic up through 1960, and then things changed. You can wrap it, I guess, around the Civil Rights Act. Critically, President Trump defeated Secretary Clinton in Georgia by about 5%, and right now we see a very, very tight vote, to say the least. On this Friday, 56 hours into a Tuesday evening, it is good to speak with Anthony Gardner. He is one of our most distinguished diplomats. His public service to Democratic public officials is noted. But Ambassador Gardner, with his perspective on the EU, has been advising the Biden campaign and Mr. Biden directly. Ambassador Gardner, thank you so much for joining us today. I think one of the great questions for our audience internationally and indeed domestically is the trite statement that this will be an Obama redux. I'm sure you disagree with that. What is the key distinction between an Obama term 1, term 2, and what you would expect from a Biden presidency?
Yes, so it's great to be on the show. You're right. I don't think this is going to be a Biden redux. I speak as a private citizen, by the way, to be absolutely clear. Because, look, no one can pretend that Donald Trump didn't exist. And by the way, he's not going anywhere, right? We can't go back to, a few minutes before midday on January 20, 2017. Too much has happened. Look, on trade is a good example. The days of trying to get an ambitious trade agreement, I think, are gone, even with our closest partner in the EU. And as you know, Tom, I was involved in that effort, which failed, unfortunately. But we're not going back to those days. I think Joe Biden will be soon, hopefully, recognized as being the lawfully elected president of the United States. But I don't think anyone is imagining we can just pretend that he never existed. Those frustrations are there. And a lot of skepticism exists in both parties about big trade deals. So we're going to have to be very targeted and very focused and explain how this is good for the middle class.
If we have a regime change, of course it would be a dramatic regime change, there's no question about that. One of the great ideas here is within our polarization, we have to find a common ground, a middle ground. Are we able to do that in our diplomacy and within trade? Is there any chance of taking the divisiveness and bringing it into a middle ground coalition statement?
Well, that's one of the big questions. So the middle ground is not exactly very strong now. It's been hollowing out for a while, and now it barely exists. But my hope is on foreign policy, at least on some bits of foreign policy, even on trade, we can define some common ground, for example, with our closest partner. And here I'm not talking about, some countries in Asia. Here I'm thinking about the old TPP, now renamed. I'm thinking about the EU, and I'm thinking about specific things we can do with the EU to create jobs and to promote exports. For example, getting rid of tariffs on industrial goods trade. Looking at very specific things we can do on regulatory reform with our closest partner. That should not be a partisan issue. When I was in Brussels at the mission to the EU, I never thought for a moment that I was promoting a partisan agenda here, and so it should be. So I am still hopeful there are things that we can do that should appeal to all Americans because they're good for all Americans.
But Ambassador Gardner, is there anything, more concrete that will actually get the people that voted for President Trump to believe that this is a legitimate election and that, Joe Biden can also be their president if Biden becomes president?
Well, I think the concept of counting votes is a profoundly democratic concept. I really don't see how this can be controversial. Evidently it is. But I'm assuming, again, that he will be president. But you're right. I mean, underneath your question lies a very important question. How do we convince the American people that working with allies, working within the system, the multilateral system that we built with Europeans and our other allies around the world, gets better results for the American people? That's what diplomats and our civil servants are paid for. That's what I was paid for. And we have to do a better job to prove that case, because obviously it hasn't been proven to the American people, and to show very concretely, look, we can do a better job, for example, on getting China to the table to address the structural issues that no doubt are problematic in terms of market access and their investment practices and their abuses. So if we can't make that case successfully, Francine, I do worry that in 4 years we'll be faced with either Donald Trump or somebody who looks like Donald Trump. So you're right, that is the exam question.
If, Anthony Gardner, it's a big if, and we're looking, of course, at Georgia. We understand that Joe Biden could have a 0.02% lead, but again, it could flip. So we have to remain very, very careful in everything that we say, especially as, it could be important for the markets. But Ambassador Gardner, when you look at the dynamics right now, what are you expecting Donald Trump to do next if he's not the president? Could he rerun for election? Is he going to be the biggest voice of opposition to the president?
Well, I don't expect him to go away. I think it would be very optimistic of anyone to think he's going to go away. I have obviously no idea what he will do, whether he's going to found a new media enterprise. He certainly has tremendous and abiding influence in the Republican Party. And that will translate into some very practical things. How much can the country do, for example, on climate change? Will President Biden have to rely on executive orders, which are going to be challenged, no doubt, in front of the courts? How much can he do domestically, for example, on a minimum wage? How much can he do, for example, on regulating tech companies? How much can he do in terms of raising taxes? All of these things, I expect Donald Trump will be very active with its allies, and it will make it very difficult to govern, I think. That's the challenge.
Thank you so much for joining us. Anthony Gardner, they're a former U.S. ambassador to the EU, and we'll have, of course, plenty more from Ambassador Gardner throughout the coming days and weeks. Let's get straight to the Bloomberg First Word News. Here's Leanne Gerrans. Hi, Leanne.
Hi, Francine. The US is the first country to report over 100,000 daily coronavirus infections. According to Johns Hopkins University, that brings the US total to 9.6 million cases. The number of deaths is also climbing, going over 1,000 for the third day in a row yesterday. Mortality rates are remaining lower than the first wave of the pandemic back in spring. Now in Europe, France has posted a record 58,000 new virus cases as the health minister warns of a violent second wave of the pandemic. France is also facing a surge in intensive care patients, now at 85% of capacity. The country started its second lockdown last week, limiting movement and closing some shops. And a mutation of COVID-19 that started in Denmark's mink population is spreading to other regions of the country. So far, there are 12 known cases of humans being infected with that new strain. The nation is talking to the World Health Organization, which it said is very worried about the findings. There are concerns this mutation could derail efforts to develop a vaccine. Global news 24 hours a day on air and at Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Leanne Gerrans. This is Bloomberg. Tom, Francine.
Leanne, thank you so much. And we'll have, of course, plenty more on Georgia. This is one to watch out for, where they're still counting, I understand, the final polls. I'm looking at Twitter. I'm looking at our great graphics team, really keeping us up to date with every second, almost ballot count. Coming up, we'll be seeing whether Clayton counting updates, of course, the Georgia election result. Again, some of the constituencies there, we've all become very familiar with it. It could lead to Joe Biden taking the state of Georgia. That would be a critical move in the election race. He has a very small lead. We'll see what happens in the next couple of minutes. This is Bloomberg.
Perhaps a president like Joe Biden, who's focused on quote unquote, making deals and compromise, might be a very positive outcome for the country going forward.
I've been in the room with then Vice President Biden and Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, and they can work well together.
It looks like he, like Trump and like Obama and like Bush and Cheney before him, will do a lot of governing through executive order. And so a lot of things that Trump has done, he can reverse or stop doing. But will that satisfy people? No.
If there is gridlock, that's something that they will be very concerned about. Clearly, the markets don't seem to be too worried about that. They seem to be pretty comfortable with the potential for gridlock.
We have to take a step back from the election, even though that has really been the central focus over the last couple of days, and realize that COVID is really what's driving this market and this economy.
The more unstable things are in the next 60 days only increases the probability we get an even bigger stimulus. And the other thing is it's all clear, right? They've made it clear now that taxes aren't going up, and people can go buy risk assets and play for the game.
Some of the commentary there as the U.S. election result still hangs in the balance. Of course, Tom and I were talking about Georgia. That's something that could, of course, be significant for Joe Biden as we're looking at the tally of the Electoral College. He needs 270. A couple of points that I see on the Markets Live blog, which are excellent, is, of course, as President Trump is challenging a lot of these vote counts, if Joe Biden takes more states, then it will be a much more comfortable position than if he only just about makes it to 270. Now, Now, a global equity rally showing signs of easing today, a touch as the presidential election count continues. U.S. futures unwinding some of the weak surge, while the dollar holding near a 2-year low. Our next guest have been excited about all week. He's one of the world's top deal makers. He first joined UBS 16 years ago as head of European M&A, within a year taking on responsibility for the role globally via senior position at Nomura. He joined UBS as chair of global M&A. Fast forward to 2018, and the Swiss bank picked him to succeed veteran Andrea Orcel. Joining us for an exclusive conversation is Piero Novelli. He's co-president of the investment bank at UBS. Piero, thank you so much for joining us today. What a day to talk about the markets. I know on the trading floor at the investment bank at UBS, you were expecting for anything to happen in the election. But what does this scenario now mean for the markets?
Good morning, Francine and Tom, and thank you for having me on the show. It is generally an important day and an important time. We have seen significant changes in the market environment over the last few days. Clearly, while there are three factors that will drive the markets going forward. Number one is the U.S. election outcome, and with great focus on fiscal stimulus. Number two is clearly the vaccine, both in terms of the phase 3 trials and deployment of the vaccine and production and approvals. And number three is, of course, the development of COVID-19, the unfortunate development in Europe and the lockdowns that are following that. So clearly, as it relates to the first topic, it seems that while any election outcome may face core challenges and potential recounts in several states, investors seem to have decided on the outcome of a Biden presidency and on a split Congress with the Republican Senate and a Democratic House. Clearly, this is a big change, and the trading on Wednesday reflected this policy and trading pivot. The market had been assuming for most of the largest part of the last month a blue wave. So clearly, the trading on Wednesday will move up strong moves into growth stocks with the expectation of a split Congress and a Biden presidency reflect a lower fiscal stimulus package potential, maybe up to $1 trillion less than a blue wave could have had. So clearly big changes there, and also big changes as it relates to corporate taxation as well as capital gain taxes and re-regulation. So clearly all this is affecting the market environment and the trading, and now we see market internals weakening a bit, maybe on a bit of profit taking by institutional investors and hedge funds.
So where would you see a possible surprise, Piero? I mean, you laid it out, exactly what the market worries are. How do you see that developing over the next 5 to 6 months? Are we going to see the market whipsawing until we have recounts and we have a clear understanding, like 100% clear understanding of what the legal implications are? Or will it start being priced in already?
So there is definitely going to be continued volatility, even though over the last 2 trading days, we have actually seen VIX coming in. On Wednesday, VIX went down by 17%. Yesterday, VIX went down by 6%, reflecting those policy pivots that we just discussed and the difference between a blue wave and a split Congress with a Biden presidency. So clearly, the volatility is there to stay. There will be more dispersion and more sector rotations. Clearly, there could be surprises. Overall, we remain constructive as it relates to the equity markets medium term, both U.S. and globally. But clearly, there can be surprises relating to 2 or 3 things. Number one, the lockdowns in Europe and mobility restrictions that will cause a double dip in growth and negative growth in Q4 in Europe. Number 2, potential negative surprises on the vaccine. We estimate that 2/3 2/3 of a positive outcome on the vaccine is already priced in the markets right now. So any delays on approvals or negative news or negative surprises on phase 3 trials would be negative for the markets. And then third, there is while the markets can look into H2 21 and discount the economic weakness over the next few quarters due to the lockdowns, there is a sector, the service sector is in a great pain, and so are many companies. And so there is a question mark as to potential weakness on credit and potential corporate defaults in the new year. So clearly, these are the things that could be negative for the market and the key risks that we need to be focused on.
Piero, Tom Keenan in New York, good morning to you. You have an exceptional experience from Merrill Lynch to UBS, the time at Nomura, and then back to your leadership at UBS in Europe. The zillion-dollar question for investment banking worldwide is, what will the U.S. banks do? With their advantages and with their flexibility, they will go to Europe and try to take market share. Are you worried about that? How will you defend Europe, Switzerland and the rest against the U.S. onslaught?
Thank you, Tom. It's a very good question. It's a question from a competitive standpoint we have had to face for the last decade, frankly. So we feel that our strategy now reflects those challenges and those threats, and we're very confident that we will be able to withstand and actually gain share, as we have done over the last 9 months, demonstrably based on our results. And that is driven by the fact that, for example, at UBS, we are a different type of financial institution, and we are very proud of that. We are the largest wealth manager globally. We have a capitalized strategy, and we are generally very diversified in terms of our geographic footprint. While all of our U.S. competitors have more than 50% of their revenues in the U.S., or approximately 50%, we are well diversified.
Piero, I don't mean to interrupt, but the
Sure,
blunt
please.
instrument is the weapon that the U.S. banks have is massive funding capabilities to make transactions go forward. Can you, within all the regulations of Europe, and it's not so much the Swiss giants, but the other continental banks, how do they defend against that stunning financial flexibility?
It's with content, ideas, technology, artificial intelligence, and data. That is what our clients on the institutional side and on the corporate side are expecting and demanding. We have been investing consistently for a decade now on our technology platform. We feel very proud of how resilient it has been during the crisis. Our results show that. We have gained market share across all of our key products in equities, in FX, in equity capital markets. So actually, it's again, content, ideas, technology, artificial intelligence, and data. That's what's going to drive market share gains, and we feel very strongly that's the right strategy.
Piero, how has your strategy of hiring top bankers in the U.S. progressed? And do you feel like you're competitive on a bonus level to make sure that you attract the top talent? Is that the only way to keep your top performers?
We have always been very competitive as it relates to compensation, and we have always been and will continue to be very targeted and very disciplined with respect to our growth in the United States. There are areas where we know we're strong globally and we're strong as a financial institution, and we know we can compete and succeed in those very targeted areas. We are investing in the U.S., and we're very pleased with what has happened so far with the market share gains we've done in cash equities and in equity derivatives, as well in ECM. So it's gone well so far.
Piero, thank you so much for the time. We really look forward to seeing you again, and particularly at some point when I'm back in London. Piero Novelli with us. He is co-president of UBS Investment Bank. Please stay with us through the morning. Biden leads in Georgia. This is Bloomberg.
Climate change is the defining issue of our time, so we've redefined how we cover it. With clear data and rigorous journalism, we rise to the scale of the challenge to reveal the breadth of possibility. We look at stories from every angle to provoke debate, spotlight solutions, and make sense of the greatest crisis of our generation. Bloomberg Green, solutions for a changing climate.
It is critically important that the markets stay open in this time, as opposed to trying to take breaks in the middle. I think that that'll just push off the situation a little bit, but actually could create other pent-up issues if you do close the markets.
Good morning, everyone. Election 2020 on a Friday after a Tuesday. We're seeing extraordinary movement, including the Vice President, Mr. Biden, taking the lead in Georgia. That'll be our major theme into the next hour as we await further election results. Andrew Sheets of Morgan Stanley will join us, linking here our economics, our finance, our investment into this great political moment. Stay with us. This is Bloomberg.
Another day of risk off across the financial markets. We bring you special coverage of all the price action and implications here on Bloomberg Television. Down to the wire, just hundreds of votes separate President Trump and Joe Biden in Georgia, although we do have an update on Georgia. Pennsylvania remains too close to call. As Joe Biden appears to pull ahead, the president says the election is being stolen despite no evidence of widespread illegal voting. And Jay Powell says it's a good time to let the institutions of democracy do their jobs. The Fed says the virus will weigh on the economy as U.S. daily cases top 100,000. Well, good morning, everyone. This is Bloomberg Surveillance. Tom Francine from London and New York. Day 3 of our election special. Of course, we look at Georgia. And Tom, we've been saying that Georgia could be quite significant because it was for such a long time a red state. Again, it's razor thin. So we saw Joe Biden ahead by a couple of hundred votes. We continue counting, I believe. So it's not definitive. And then, what we've been saying, Tom, is that we have to be careful because there could potentially be recounts. And we could, of course, potentially see delays over the next couple of days and weeks.
Some perspective on that, Francine. My first calculation of the 5-state differential this morning was 153,000 out of 143 million votes. That's 0.1%. You'd wonder if you'd have a 5-state recount. I'm kidding. That wouldn't occur. Let's get narrow, Francine. In 1960, all the focus was on Illinois and Mayor Daley in Chicago. The real battle was in Hawaii. The differential there between John F. Kennedy and Richard M. Nixon was all of 115 votes. The recount, there was a recount in Hawaii, and there was a swing from Nixon to Kennedy in 1960. You really wonder, Francine, is that what we have in store as we stagger to December?
Yeah, and Georgia, just on Georgia, Tom, just to add a bit of color. I know I was very focused on Georgia, actually,
yes, you were.
Over the last month and a half, because this is a very important state. It's a state that I believe has only voted about, 3 times for a Democratic president. 2 of those times were actually only 2 times before this, if it does go to a Democratic president. 2 of those were 1976. And actually in 1990s, where Jimmy Carter was on the ballot. And President Trump, back in 2016, won the state by 5.1% difference. So actually, it would be even symbolically a pretty important point, even if it is a razor-thin majority. Again, we need to wait and see, but that's what it's pointing to at the moment. Let's get straight to the Bloomberg First Word News. Here's Ritika Gupta. Hi, Ritika.
Morning, Francine. Tom. Joe Biden is tightening his hold on the race for the White House. He's now taken the lead in Georgia, also leads in Nevada, and is catching up to President Trump in Pennsylvania. Biden is closing in on the 270 electoral votes needed for election. He said he has no doubt that once the vote counting is over, he'll be the winner. Meanwhile, President Trump's campaign filed or promised lawsuits in 4 swing states. He said the election is being stolen from him despite no evidence of widespread illegal voting. Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell has opened the door to a possible shift in the central bank's bond purchases. He told reporters that more fiscal and monetary support is needed because rising coronavirus infections threaten the economy. For now, policymakers agree to maintain their bond buying at the current rate. Economists expect the U.S. government's latest jobs report to reflect a slowdown in the labor market. The median estimate in the Bloomberg survey says the economy created 593,000 jobs last month. That's down from 661,000 back in September. The jobs report is out at 8:30 a.m. New York time. And in France, there's been a record number of new coronavirus cases. Authorities reported more than 58,000 new infections, and the government's health minister warns that there's what he calls a violent second wave of the disease. France started a second lockdown last week. Global News 24 hours a day on air and at Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Ritika Gupta. This is Bloomberg. Francine, Tom.
Ritika, thanks so much. The data, it has been 2 days up, I should say 2 weeks up, wrong, 2 days up, I should say, in the equity markets with strong correlations yesterday, particularly an explosively weak dollar. We take a pause before Jobs Day at 8:30. Seems distant right now, but yes, it is a statement on American unemployment, with a lot of people unemployed in America. One statistic I saw was 12 million jobs have been lost over the recent months. Futures take a pause, -46. The VIX moves back almost 2 points, 29.41. Francine, I'll keep it short. Continued dollar weakness this morning, and the yen 103.38.
Yeah, Tom, I think we're seeing just a bit of whipsaw actually in the markets. So if you look at, what we've been seeing, so the global stocks rally seems to be stalling. European equities are dropping. Technology is down. The dollar's pretty much steady near a 2-week low. And then I am seeing a lot of movement actually in emerging markets as people feel a bit more confident about a risk-on mood. Treasuries, again, just a bit more context on this. A little changed after Fed officials kept interest rates near zero on Thursday. But you're absolutely right, Tom. If we have a second wave, how will that impact hiring? And how will that impact, of course, the Fed projections and U.S. jobs?
Very good. Right now, I think the best thing to do, and particularly after the moment last night of the president speaking at the White House, let us listen to the two candidates.
We continue to feel, Senator and I, we continue to feel very good about where things stand. We have no doubt that when the count is finished, Senator Harris and I will be declared the winners. So I ask everyone to stay calm, all the people to stay calm. The process is working. The count is being completed, and we'll know very soon.
A lot of litigation because we have so much evidence, so much proof, and it's going to end up perhaps at the highest court in the land. We'll see. As you know, I've claimed certain states, and he's claiming states, and we can both claim the states, but ultimately I have a feeling judges are going to have to rule.
The two candidates are as exhausted as everyone else here. I calculated some 56 hours on from where we'd be with concession and victory speeches of a Tuesday evening. Watching this in London at Chatham House is Amy Pope of Duke University and, of course, her service to the nation under President Obama. Amy, we're talking to each other way, way too often in the recent days. Amy, what I really want to know is when these two parties go in the courtroom to talk to state-level judges. The president talks about we're going to go to the Supreme Court. Well, before that, they've got to go into maybe a federal courtroom or maybe a state courtroom. Who is actually at those tables? I mean, this is not Perry Mason. What actually happens in those courtrooms?
Well, in the first instance, they actually have to present evidence of wrongdoing. And most of what the president has alleged as fraud is not fraud at all. And that's why you're seeing so many of these cases get tossed out so quickly. So the claims that you can't count the votes, for example, after Election Day, there's just no basis in law for that. Some of their claims about access to the voting booth or observation, all of these things, a court is going to take a good look at it, but they're not the deciders of the election. They're just looking to make sure that people have an opportunity to vote. It's being done fairly, and there's no fraud. And so far, the president's claims just aren't standing up.
Amy, when you look at some of the recounts, right, we will see a couple of states having to recount only because it's a very razor-thin, majority in certain cases. Is that correct, or could we actually see no recounts?
No, I think we will likely see a recount in a place like Georgia, where it looks like we're talking about a very, very small difference in votes. But if we're talking about thousands or tens of thousands of votes, then it's much less likely. I mean, the president has claimed that he wants to seek a recount in the Midwest, for example, but the impact of that is not really clear. If you're talking about several hundred votes, if you go back to Bush v. Gore, we're talking about a vote difference in the hundreds. This is not that so far.
Amy, what is the most surprising thing that you've seen over the last 24 hours? I mean, President Trump really claiming that this is, almost unlawful in certain cases election. Will it actually have an impact of his voters? How much of the democratic process does his words actually change the way people feel, their vote is being counted?
In the first instance, let's be clear, it is not unlawful to vote against President Trump. I mean, that is democracy in action. Why the president insists on going down this path is really puzzling, even from a strategic point of view. In some ways, he's doing incredibly well. The race was not a landslide for Vice President Biden and Senator Harris. He's still very much in play in key states. Right. And it's a puzzling strategy. Why foment anxiety and civil unrest when you're actually doing relatively well? It suggests to me that he thinks he won't win.
And I mean, what's so important here, and I should point out, folks, that Mr. Biden has a record number in the popular vote, and I believe Mr. Trump's 69 million is the second most votes ever seen within a presidential election. Amy, to your good point there on the tension of how the Republicans are doing versus the Democrats, great. But what it really comes from is a distrust of elites within the system. It's those guys at a given convention center who we really don't trust. What is the solution for the elites to straighten out our voting process so there's a greater trust among Democrats and among Republicans?
I think one of the key issues here is campaign finance reform. There is so much money going in to fund these campaigns, and money that's coming from outside of the jurisdiction. And that causes a lot of frustration, anxiety, and distrust in the system. And as you know, there are not a lot of limits on how people can fund money. There are limits on individual contributions, but there are all sorts of loopholes around that. And that means that there are influences on the system and on the outcomes that are not directly related to the people who live in that particular district.
Amy Pope, thank you so much. Too short a visit today with Chatham House, of course, and fellow in the U.S. and America's program there, also working in Homeland Security for President Obama. Oh, yes, they're the markets, the linkage of economics into finance and investment. A good time then to speak to Andrew Sheets of Morgan Stanley on the surge we've seen in the markets, even with a pause today. Let us not forget, it is Jobs Day in America. Biden leads in Georgia. This is Bloomberg.
Perhaps a president like Joe Biden, who's focused on quote unquote, making deals and compromise, might be a very positive outcome for the country going forward.
I've been in the room with then Vice President Biden and Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, and they can work well together.
It looks like he, like Trump and like Obama and like Bush and Cheney before him, will do a lot of governing through executive order. And so a lot of things that Trump has done, he can reverse or stop doing. But will that satisfy people? No.
If there is gridlock, that's something that they will be very concerned about. The markets don't seem to be too worried about that. They seem to be pretty comfortable with the potential for gridlock.
We have to take a step back from the election, even though that has really been the central focus over the last couple of days, and realize that COVID is really what's driving this market and this economy.
The more unstable things are in the next 60 days only increases the probability we get an even bigger stimulus. And the other thing is it's all clear, right? They've made it clear now that taxes aren't going up and, people can go buy risk assets and play for the game.
Top investors and economists discussing the contentious election between Donald Trump and, of course, between Joe Biden. Well, joining us now for some market perspective is Andrew Sheets, Morgan Stanley Chief Cross-Asset Strategist. Andrew, thank you for joining us. If you look at what the market is thinking, it seems, but I could be wrong, it seems that it's priced in a Biden presidency very close, almost razor-thin margin with a Senate that's more Republican. What happens if there's a surprise?
Well, I think there are kind of a few things to kind of keep in mind. I think first, even though this was a real roller coaster of an election night, I think we've landed on a scenario that is most likely one of the less volatile for the markets. It means the least amount of policy change relative to some of the other scenarios that were out there, the least amount of shifts that investors would need to do to their portfolios given the less amount of policy change. And we had very high levels of expected volatility going into this event, which could then moderate. So I think that's one important takeaway. But the other important takeaway, and maybe we'll talk about this later, is that this election is also not completely finished. We still have the potential for these two runoff Senate races in Georgia, and so the balance of power in the Senate, which remains very important for that policy outlook, could still hang in the balance.
Andrew, I'm going to ask you a question which I've never asked before about the U.S., which, often we talk about European countries, but given the election is so close, is the U.S. actually governable?
Well, I think that I think the answer is yes, but I think it's a question of the scale of policy shifts that I think, one, this is why these two Senate races in Georgia could become so important, because a Senate that's 50-50, Democrats and Republicans, where Kamala Harris would have the ability to break a tie, is a very different Senate from one that's 49-51 in terms of a Biden administration's ability to do things. And also, I do think this means that if we end up with one of these divided government outcomes where the Senate's very close, but Biden has taken the presidency, then I think there are really two key conclusions from that. One is the outlook for COVID becomes more important because the ability of fiscal policy to respond to it aggressively is more restrained. So the market will be more sensitive to news on a vaccine or news on new cases. And it might mean foreign policy is more important because that's one thing that an administration can have more leeway on and doesn't need as much, doesn't depend as much on Congress.
Andrew Sheets, Tom Keene in New York. Good morning to you. We have had in 4 trading days, maybe 5, and almost 4 standard deviation round trip in equities. NASDAQ 100 surging. You saw the gamma yesterday in Japanese yen. I believe I've never seen such an abrupt move. What does it signal?
Well, I do think it means that the market, was ironically, I think, by reducing some of the tail scenarios around this election, right? I think there were many investors who were expecting a larger Democratic sweep, which could have meant some really transformative policy shifts. I think there were many other investors thinking back to 2016 that thought the president would be reelected, that there would be another surprise. And so in cutting off each of those kind of extreme events, I think you actually had markets that then needed to do some initial adjustment to kind of almost bring them back to where they were a couple of weeks ago, right? We've been chopping around, but we've been chopping around in this range. So I think that that's the key dynamic here.
Andrew Sheets, thank you so much. Andrew Sheets there of Morgan Stanley stays with us. Now, we'll have plenty more, of course, on the markets. We'll also look at the U.S. jobs, given what Powell has said. And, of course, let's not forget, because of this election craziness, we look at, electoral colleges, we look at districts in certain states, but we can't keep, of course, forgetting what's happening also with coronavirus. The fact that there's a big second wave, I think over 100,000 infected in the U.S., that will have a significant and clear impact on hiring. Coming up in the next hour, Catherine Mann, Citigroup Global Chief Economist. That's at 6 a.m. in New York, 11 a.m. in London, and this is Bloomberg.
Women leaders were actually better at controlling the deaths from COVID-19. Do you think out of this pandemic, we'll see more countries be willing to elect female leaders?
When we look at women leaders, we tend to project on them baggage that they shouldn't bear.
Women are given an opportunity when no one else wants to do the job.
Women had a very clear objective. They wanted to save lives.
The women leaders, if you look at their careers, have also built up a level of trust.
In fact, women have to be better at communication in order to be elected as leaders, whereas this doesn't hold true for men.
We need to get those sexist stereotypes out of our head and give women a fair run for leadership.
Trying to change the stereotypes about women is not only the business of women, but men have to be part of it.
Do you think you'll have to produce less beer in 2021?
No, I don't think so. I think consumers will find a way. But I mean, if there are restrictions, but consumers, of course, they're smart and they'll learn to live with those restrictions. I think some occasions will migrate.
Mercedes-Benz is on a path towards CO2 neutral mobility. So we have flicked the switch there, and really we're going to step by step electrify everything. And what does that mean? Combustion engines get electrified.
Give you a sense of the real-time action, the 10-year yield tumbling now 11 basis points, so continuing in this knee-jerk risk-off feel.
This is Bloomberg Surveillance. I'm Rishka Gupta with your Bloomberg Business Flash. It's a promising sign from one of the world's biggest automakers in the midst of the pandemic. Toyota raised its profit outlook for the fiscal year by almost threefold. Quarterly earnings and sales also beat analyst estimates. Toyota is boosting production to meet growing demand. Uber is trying to reassure investors after posting a wider loss in the third quarter. CEO Dara Khosrowshahi said he's confident the ride-hailing service will post a quarterly profit by the end of next year. He's also predicting that Uber's delivery service would reverse its losses too. The coronavirus pandemic has hammered sales. They were down 18%.
quarterly sales more than doubled at Square, the San Francisco-based payments company. That underscored a surge in demand for stock purchases and other financial transactions by customers cooped up during the pandemic. They were using Square's peer-to-peer payments application called Cash App. It lets users send money to friends, buy stocks, and store money like a bank account. And that's your latest Bloomberg Business Flash. Francine.
Thank you so much, Ritika. Now we'll have plenty more, of course, on the U.S. election race. We understand that 99% of the vote count has been happening in Georgia, and it still gives Joe Biden with a razor-thin lead. The market's focusing on that. They're focusing, of course, on a number of things, including what we're seeing in terms of infections around the world. And if you look at global stocks, that rally is actually stalling. I don't know if we have my board up, Tom, but maybe you have yours, so you can take it away.
Well, the boards are up, and it shows a churning data, nothing like the emotion that we saw yesterday. And yes, there's a flatness here, even a pullback in equities. Again, futures at negative 36. A VIX reverses by a figure 28.85. I really want to focus on foreign exchange and the deep litmus paper there, and that would be sterling advancing 131.26 over the last number of days. On euro, 118.57 is remarkable. We heard from Lord O'Neill in the last hour, really making clear how these currency movements could impinge exports for some countries off a weak dollar. Speaking of weak dollar, yen 103.39 is really extraordinary. Again, in the equity markets, I'd focus on the Pacific Rim, Asia DXY 107.56. Coming up on America, China, and the Pacific Rim, Ian Bremmer with David Weston, Balance of Power. This is Bloomberg.
Decirle a los empleadores que fueran más humanitarios con sus trabajadores, que les hagan valer sus derechos. Y estábamos viviendo en dos casas, en unas 50 personas y en la otra otras 50. En cada casa había 5 habitaciones. En cada habitación había de 3 a 4 camas abarrotadas. Vivíamos de 6 a 7 personas, un baño para cada habitación y una cocina para todas. Una vez que nos atendieron en el hospital, al salir nos avisó una compañera que ya nos habían reportado a migración. Gracias a Dios ahorita de salud yo estoy muy bien, pero en lo moral no estoy muy bien, porque a causa de esta enfermedad yo perdí todo, perdí mi trabajo. Yo creo que mi caso resulta un gran problema de cómo las personas migrantes estamos en riesgo de explotación por parte de los empleadores.
Really a reminder, isn't it, just how sensitive the markets are to any commentary about trade. We did see some pressure on the yuan, we did see some pressure on the futures. That is now being reversed.
Election 2020. Good morning, everyone. Bloomberg surveillance from London, from New York. It has been an exhausting week as we continue, as John Farrow would say, well into Tuesday evening. If you're just joining us, Georgia has gone positive for Mr. Biden by ever so a bit under 1,000 votes, but it is noted as well. But there are many other stories among the 5 states. Our Ed Ludlow is in San Francisco. He is hoping the race is decided today so he can focus on Chelsea, Sheffield United tomorrow. But before that, we've got to get an update on his focus, which is Arizona and Nevada. Ed, I've been dying to ask you about Arizona. There is a presumption that Mr. Trump is gaining, but he literally will run out of time. He'll run out of votes of those counted. What happens in Maricopa County that gives the president any hope is he literally runs out of countable votes?
Yeah, I mean, sources on both sides are telling me that the ballots that remain, around 300,000 statewide, but 200,000 in Maricopa County, will be heavily skewed towards Joe Biden and the Democratic Party. What Republicans were hoping for on Election Day was a big surge of in-person voting, because that's what the president told his supporters to do. And they were happy with the proportion of voters that turned out on Election Day. But when I spoke to Republican officials and strategists that night at the Trump campaign event, they were worried about the volumes. Now they're trying to play catch up. Yes, the margin in Maricopa County, which is where 60% of the state's electorate lives, and sort of more broadly in the state, yes, it's narrowing. But, you know, the sources are telling me it's just not narrowing by enough. And they're pretty confident that even though it's tight, and it was always going to be a tight race, that the ballots that are still to be counted, principally mail-in early ballots, will be skewed towards Joe Biden and the Democratic Party. And what I'm hearing is that they think that Joe Biden will hold on.
Ed, how many recounts are we looking at?
In terms of recounts, did you say?
Recounts.
I don't think there's as big a question in Arizona over the validity of the ballots that are being cast. Arizona is very good at counting votes. It's had this system in place since 1992. A very high proportion of that ballot is early voting. They've been counting votes for 2 weeks. And so, you know, the president has been tweeting today, of course, on the legality and validity of these votes. But in Arizona, there is high confidence on the validity of the votes that have been counted and will be counted starting tomorrow morning.
And one final question. What do we need to watch in Nevada? Do we watch Las Vegas, or do we also need to watch Reno?
No, Las Vegas, you know, it is a blue county, Clark County, where, you know, there is still a high number of ballots to be counted. But it's also a city in Las Vegas that's been devastated by the coronavirus. And it's a similar story to the one in Arizona, that people are still voting for President Trump based on economic platform, based on the pace at which he pushed to reopen the economies in those states. And what I'm hearing in Nevada is, even in cases with registered Democrats, those that are hardest hit by the virus in the leisure industry, in the casinos, in some cases they are voting for the president because they like what he did when it came to reopening the economy there. But that's the one to watch. High proportion of ballots coming out of a deeply blue county in Clark County, which is where Las Vegas is.
Ed Ludlow, thank you so much. And folks, I really want to make clear the distinction here is, even in Arizona, we've got 90%, 89% of the vote counted. So there's a real runway there for Mr. Trump. The experts say not enough runway. The Delta in Arizona, 47,000 votes. And in smaller Nevada, about 1/3 smaller, I would say 11,000 vote difference in Nevada. And we'll be following that. Again, Mr. Biden ahead in Georgia. We continue now with Andrew Sheets of Morgan Stanley. And of course, we're looking at the greater economy, and we're looking at investment as well. Andrew, I really want to talk about, is the lawyers say, a carefully diversified portfolio. How do you diversify at the zero bound?
Well, thanks, Tom. And look, I mean, I think it's clearly a really large challenge. I mean, we saw this in the week that preceded the election. You had the S&P 500 sell off over 5% and 10-year interest rates rise. So you know, clearly, I think that just kind of highlights the challenges that bonds have in providing diversification, you know, down at these levels. And that's a challenge that's even greater in markets like Europe and Japan, where those yields are even lower. So I think there are a few things that investors are looking looking at. I do think this is actually something that's drawn investors towards assets in China, where the correlations of both the Chinese fixed income market and the Chinese equity market are significantly lower than other markets, and have been that way for a long period of time. I think there's a long history of those asset markets being decorrelated to others, and I think that's important. I think this will also cause people to potentially look at credit as a alternative to government bonds, in the sense that it provides just a little bit more yield, but also provides a relatively low volatility asset that can help add some ballast to portfolios.
What do you do with EM? We've got a number of houses trumpeting a resurgence of EM, almost a growthiness to the Pacific Rim. Do you buy it?
Yeah, I think as a house we've been more cautious on EM equities relative to other regions. That remains our view. I do think it's interesting that the last 5 days EM equities have badly lagged equities in Europe and the U.S. So I do understand that there's a narrative out there, but I think so far it's not clear that it's borne out in kind of the post-election performance. And we do have some concerns that the valuations in EM are less cheap than I think.
Ladies and gentlemen, new order placed for British pound at 131.317. I'm looking to sell short. Actually, I will move it to 131.32. Just to round it, okay?
And obviously, we have to balance this against a market that's done really well. Chinese A shares are up around 19% year to date. They've that's almost triple what the S&P 500 has done. So I think that we do as a house at Morgan Stanley have a pretty optimistic view on the Chinese economy. We're above consensus. We think that strong growth performance will continue. The fact that the market has done as well as it has this year does limit some of our upside, but we continue to have a view, and Jonathan Gardner, our emerging market strategist and Asia equity strategist.
I opened new short position for British pound at 131.32.
Andrew, are we losing sight of what's happening with COVID? I mean, I know it's a special week because of the U.S. election, but is now a double-dip recession a given?
Well, I actually think that's a really important question to focus on, because I think you're right. I think we've had an event that has pushed COVID off of the front page, so to speak. But the cases are still getting worse in the U.S. They're still trending up in Europe. The pandemic has not gone away. It's still there. If anything, it's getting more serious. And I actually think you potentially have also arrived at an election outcome where the market would care more about COVID than in other outcomes, right? Because I think if we had a Democratic sweep or Republican sweep, then the market might have said, well, look, even though maybe I can look beyond the rise in COVID cases, because we're going to get such aggressive policy next year that it won't matter as much to the economy. But now that I think we're looking at an outcome that's more likely to generate gridlock, more likely to impede further policy, then kind of where the cases go, what updates we get potentially at the end of this month on vaccines, I think those carry far more weight to where the market will go. So I think that's absolutely the right question to answer. I think this election result, one of its conclusions is that the market is going to be more sensitive to COVID developments than it would have been under other scenarios.
Andrew, just to be clear here, what is the Mike Wilson, Andrew Sheets call now on the equity market? Are you deploying capital to equities, or is there a real caution?
Yeah, so I think the way that we've been thinking about it, and I think Mike's done a great job of kind of articulating this and being clear over the last couple of over the last month or so, is we really see the S&P as range bound, somewhere between 3550 at the upside and 3100 on the downside. And so I think as we get near the top of that range, where we want to be a little bit more cautious, we do not think that we're going to get a big breakout in the near term in equity markets, as a result of this election. But at the same time, we think think the downside is also pretty well capped. You've removed some uncertainty. You do have still a very dovish Fed, and so as you get closer to 3,200, then you want to be accumulating. So that's the way we've kind of been trying to think about it and go forward. Yeah.
Well, a good update, Andrew Sheets. Thank you so much. And I should note, Ellen Zentner will join Bloomberg Surveillance here later in the morning. Right now, futures -30. With our first word news in New York, here's Ritika Gupta.
Thanks, Tom. Joe Biden has now overtaken President Trump in the state of Georgia. The latest tally of votes gives the Democrat a slight lead. Biden has also cut into the president's advantage in Pennsylvania. He's getting closer to those 270 electoral votes he needs to win the election. President Trump says the election is being stolen from him, but he's offered no evidence to back up that claim. His campaign has filed or promised to file lawsuits in several battleground states. President Trump's special treatment on Twitter would end in January if he's not re-elected. Twitter has often left up tweets from the president that violate its policies, although it adds a warning. But if Donald Trump were no longer president, his tweets could be removed entirely if they include hate speech or types of false information. The U.S. has become the first country to have 100,000 new coronavirus cases in just one day. That's according to data from Johns Hopkins University and Bloomberg. Indiana, Ohio, Michigan, and Illinois were amongst states reporting record number of infections yesterday. China's President Xi Jinping is signaling a different sort of long-term vision for the country's economy. Xi calls for it to expand at an average pace of less than 5% a year. That's well below the historical trend of the last 30 years. Xi addressed China's top decision makers behind closed doors last week. The last five-year plan was released in 2015 and called for 6.5% growth. Global news 24 hours a day on air and at Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Ritika Gupta. This is Bloomberg. Francine, Tom.
Ritika Gupta, thank you so much. It is Jobs Day. Coming up, as I mentioned, Ellen Zentner will join us with Morgan Stanley. I just looked at the data, actually pretty good data. Unemployment rate survey, 7.9%, down to a more attractive 7.6%. Stay with us. It is election 2020. Important results from New Jersey and from Nevada. This is Bloomberg.
Welcome to That's Debatable, an interactive series on today's most pressing issues. The resolution this time, is a U.S.-China space race good for humanity? We'll hear from both sides.
The competition, if you look at the past, led to innovation.
A whole new arms race could start.
And we'll get your perspective, too, with help from the artificial intelligence of IBM Watson. I'm John Donvan. Join us for That's Debatable, presented by Bloomberg and Intelligence Squared, Friday on Bloomberg Television.
Their CPG history, their experience, and really how we might be able to combine together to really create this fantastic public company. And So we kind of got into the SPAC thing a little bit before it became such a hot method of going public.
Good morning, everyone. This is Bloomberg Surveillance, day 3 of the U.S. election special. I'm Francine Lack in London, Tom Keene in New York. We, of course, look at state by state in the U.S. We try and break down also the counties. We look at the number of votes that have been cast and counted. The picture for the markets is a little bit different today. Now, we had 2 days of rallies. That was very clear to see for everyone. And global stocks, that rally is now halting a little bit. We did have a bit of fluctuation with the dollar here in Europe. We were up, but now we're on the lower side of things. And again, the dollar is holding steady, but I think President Trump attacking the credibility of the election may be casting a doubt on the vote, and that's maybe being priced in on the markets. The other thing I'm watching out for is, of course, Treasuries. Little changed after the Fed kept interest rates near zero. We did have, though, some comments on hiring and, of course, coronavirus, and then later on, it's U.S. payrolls day today.
It is U.S. payrolls day. We call that jobs day sometimes. It'll be most interesting to see. On the data front, it's real simple. Euro yen, 122.52. That's had some action recently. We saw much stronger yen, but in the last 12 hours or so, stronger euro, 118.65 on euro dollar, and yen has been just absolutely stunning, 103.26, much stronger as well. Futures negative 28. Coming up, as we continue the political analysis, Kevin Cirilli scheduled to be with us. Martin Schenker will join us as well. And Wendy Schiller will join from Brown University, just one of our best, with historical perspective on this most historic American moment. Stay with us. This is Bloomberg.
We explore the trends, investments, and competition of the European ETF industry. Join us on Bloomberg ETF IQ Europe.
America Americans want the democracy that they have. They want democracy. I'm not sure that this election is showing that democracy isn't working. I'd say just the contrary. It shows there's a democracy working.
And the democracy is working. And we thank Kenneth Rogoff for his attendance yesterday, particularly on our debt and our deficit. Right now, with futures negative 28, and of course the tick by tick of the presidential election, what we saw from Mr. Biden and Mr. Trump yesterday, it is about the legislative branch as well. Our Martin Schenker has been a student of Capitol Hill for many decades. Our chief content officer joins us now. I love the phrase, Marty, the Republicans flipped a seat in the Senate. The Democrats have flipped 2 seats with 1 net gain. And yet I see in all the media, including Bloomberg, a wringing of hands among the Democrats over the success of taking 1 more seat. Why the disappointment?
Well, there were really great hopes that the Biden candidacy would bring along some flipping of the Senate seats in Maine, for instance, where Susan Collins pulled out a victory there. So there is disappointment, but it might be a little bit premature. What's happening in Georgia is very interesting. There'll be a runoff on those 2 seats as of this moment. As you know, anything is possible.
Anything is possible, and of course, Georgia will be critical. But what this comes down to is the value of the vice president in the Senate. When Vice President Harris, if we have a Biden win, when Vice President Harris walks up to the lectern, how will this new Senate be different?
Well, it'll be different because if it does turn out to be a 50-50 split in the Senate, Kamala Harris is going to cast that tie-breaking vote. Essentially, it means that the Democrats have taken the Senate. And I think that the whole issue of what kind of agenda Joe Biden can pursue will change dramatically if that happens.
Marty, overall, I mean, we're still counting a lot of the ballots. Could some of these states still flip? What kind of razor-thin majority are we talking about? And what are the states at this moment that you think we're getting wrong or that we're calling maybe a bit too quickly?
Well, I mean, I think the elephant in the country is Arizona. As you know, Fox News now famously or perhaps infamously called that very early Tuesday night. AP followed early in the morning, hours later. The Trump administration, the Trump campaign was very upset that was called. And in fact, no other organizations who are tracking this race have called that race. So it's still in play. There will be more votes tabulated today. And I think it's still an issue of whether Arizona has, in fact, gone to Biden. I'd rather be in Joe Biden's place in Arizona than Donald Trump, but it's still up in the air.
Marty, Republicans have opened legal fights to stop counts. A lot of these have been thrown out. What are the ones that actually have not been thrown out?
Well, there's this case before the Supreme Court that was decided 4-4, which was basically tabled involving the separation of certain ballots in Pennsylvania. But even if the Supreme Court were to take that one on, it only involves a couple of 10 or tens of thousands of votes rather than hundreds of thousands of votes. So it really wouldn't have much of an impact. And it looks like Joe Biden is headed to overtake Donald Trump in Pennsylvania. So Pennsylvania is ground zero for this legal battle, in my opinion. And that'll play out over the next days and weeks.
Marty, is our team in Washington yet seeing a Republican distancing from the president?
Not really. And that's, I think, like we all are, we're waiting to see just where this election stands before positioning themselves. And I think the real person we should be looking at is Mitch McConnell. He has a relationship with Joe Biden. What kind of relationship will he try to develop? I believe Joe Biden is going to have a honeymoon if he does become president, and that he has a working relationship with Mitch McConnell that could actually produce results in the first 100 days.
Marty, just really, really interesting. I guess one final question. if I could, Marty, what are you going to look for this morning besides 8 hours sleep?
I'm not getting those hours, Tom. We're going to get a big vote dump out of Nevada. I think a lot of people assume that that's going to go to Joe Biden. And so I'd look at Nevada this morning, and if any of the monitors of this race call Georgia, call Pennsylvania, and take Joe Biden over the top.
Marty, what's the level of angst right now in the Republican Party? So we have a president saying that, you know, some of the vote counting is completely illegitimate, but we don't have any foundation for that. And then we have one of his sons also asking people to go to total war because of this election. I mean, you know, how uncomfortable is the Republican Party right now?
You know, I mentioned Mitch McConnell earlier. I think he is kind of a critical figure here. If the polls show that Joe Biden has won the electoral vote, I personally think it's incumbent upon the Republicans to stand up and acknowledge that fact. And Mitch McConnell is going to be the person who we need to see do that, which I think will lower the temperature around the country.
Marty Schenker, thank you so much. Greatly, greatly appreciate it. Our Chief Content Officer, his leadership in Washington through this historic week. I do want to make one point, which has come up a bit, but maybe less so. Of the 146 million votes that we've seen, the popular vote, the all-in national vote, it's extraordinary to see the plurality that Mr. Biden has. It is 0.8 of a percentage point greater than what Hillary Clinton did a few years ago. That's a huge, you take 0.8 and divide it by 2.1 and you get a huge popular vote pickup by Mr. Biden over what was seen in the Democrats in 2016. It is Jobs Day. It is a fractured America on so many fronts. An important, timely interview. Catherine Mann will join us from Citigroup as well. And yes, as Mr. Schenker says, look for Nevada results. This is Bloomberg.
This is Bloomberg Best, your weekly review of the most important business news, analysis, and interviews from Bloomberg Television around the world.
Ken Burns, welcome to Bloomberg Big Decisions.
We have always been a mixture of things. We are always stronger for that mixture.
Growth is a way to stay competitive, delight more and more consumers.
Welcome to the Best of Bloomberg Technology. I'm Emily Chang.
They've moved the needle by acknowledging that they have to monitor the content.
What is one word of advice you'll take with you?
Learn how to listen. And that is certainly something that has served me well.
Ankiti, where do you go from here? It's a huge market. It's a huge opportunity. I want to go 100x from here.
Our philosophy is to partner where we can and stand apart when we should.
Good morning, everyone. It is from Friday, some 56 hours past Tuesday evening concession and victory speeches. Will we have a new president? Will there be recounts into December? Team Biden, well, they request calm and patience. Team Trump demands any vote that came in after Election Day will not be counted. Registrars of voters want to, quote, not count fast and make sure we are being accurate. Various and sundry judges say, show us fraud evidence. The president says, quote, they are trying to steal the election. And finally, it's simple. Within this pandemic, it is an American Jobs Day. Where have 12 million jobs gone? Good morning, everyone. Bloomberg surveillance from New York, from London. It is still Tuesday evening, as our colleague John Farrow says. And Francine, absolutely remarkable to see the distraction of this election and how it's redounded across all of the news flow of America and, of course, around the world. I guess, Francine, what I would say is the people count the votes in these 5 hugely disputed states. All eyes right now tilt to Nevada.
Yes, Tom, and there are about, also 15 different angles, which I know we'll spend the next 3 months trying to analyze. It's what happened to the polls, why is actually counting so slow in certain states, and what can we learn for the next presidential election. But Tom, let's remember the markets. So the markets are no longer rallying. Of course, we all wait with bated breath, and I've been saying that about 500,000 times in the last 3 days. But really, I've never seen, everyone really across the world staying up, trying to figure out exactly what this happens, because it's, on tenterhooks, really razor thin. But Tom, let's not forget there are 100,000 people in the U.S. with COVID. We've entered lockdowns here in Europe. And we now talk about a double-dip recession. I don't know whether it will come or not, but that's one of the narratives that the markets will be looking at.
Don't see the recession talk so much in America, but certainly in Europe, and you see it within yield dynamics as well. I'm thrilled to say that Catherine Mann will join us from Citigroup in a bit. I believe Kevin Cirilli answered the alarm today, and perhaps we'll hear from our chief Washington correspondent. You need an update on this historic election. Here's Ritika Gupta.
Thank you, Tom. Joe Biden is tightening his hold on the race for the White House. He's now taken the lead in Georgia, also leads in Nevada, and is catching up to President Trump in Pennsylvania. Biden is closing in on those 270 electoral votes needed for election win. He said he has no doubt that once the vote counting is over, he'll be the winner. Meanwhile, President Trump's campaign filed or promised lawsuits in 4 swing states. He said the election is being stolen from him, despite no evidence of widespread illegal voting. And Fed Chair Jerome Powell has opened the door to a possible shift in the central bank's bond purchases. He told reporters that more fiscal and monetary support is needed because rising coronavirus infections threaten the economy. For now, policymakers agreed to maintain their bond buying at the current rate. And economists expect the U.S. government's latest jobs report to reflect a slowdown in the labor market. The median estimate in the Bloomberg survey says the economy created 593,000 jobs last month. That's down from 661,000 in September. The jobs report is out at 8:30 a.m. New York time. In France, there's been a record number of new coronavirus cases. Authorities reported more than 58,000 new infections, and the government's health minister warns that there's what he calls a violent second wave of the disease. France started a second lockdown last week. Global news, 24 hours a day on air and at Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Ritika Gupta. This is Bloomberg. Francine, Tom.
All right, Ritika, thanks so much. With the data check, it's simple. We're negative 25 on the markets. I do want to give you the data on these 5 contested states as well. Georgia, 917 small votes in favor of Biden, 11,000 in Nevada, 47,000 in Arizona. That will be really interesting today. North Carolina, off the radar, 76,000 in Philadelphia and Pennsylvania. Absolutely stunning. Let me focus on that right now. El Schmidt, their election head, probably will have a statement today with some 50,000 votes remaining to count, and the delta there is only 18,000. That is a remarkable statistic, Francine, after where we were 12 hours ago, and indeed 24 hours ago. In some geographies of Pennsylvania, Mr. Biden taking 80% plus of the new count.
And we also heard from the city commissioner, Al Schmidt of Philadelphia. Tom, I think they were speaking on a U.S. network, and he was saying that also he confirmed that both observers from the Trump and the Biden campaigns have been present and looking at the counting process, something that is legally required in the state to make sure that they're validated. So something that we need to keep an eye on. When I'm looking at my data, Tom, a lot of the focus, of course, is on the U.S. election, on the number of infections. We're seeing, stocks whipsaw a little bit as I think they're trying to hold on to something. Maybe the U.S. jobs data a little bit later on will give them that something.
Very good. We will continue forward here. We need to get to Kevin Cirilli with the scope of the land today, this Friday. 56 hours on, roughly, from where you would see concession speeches. They didn't happen. Victory speeches, they didn't happen. But what has been happening is a managing of two disparate messages. Let's listen.
We continue to feel, Senator and I, we continue to feel very good about where things stand. We have no doubt that when the count is finished, Senator Harris and I will be declared the winners. So I ask everyone to stay calm, all the people to stay calm. The process is working. The count is being completed, and we'll know very soon.
We think we will win the election very easily. We think there's going to be a lot of litigation because we have so much evidence, so much proof, and it's going to end up perhaps at the highest court in the land. We'll see. As you know, I've claimed certain states, and he's claiming states, and we can both claim the states, but ultimately I have a feeling judges are going to have to rule.
There we were last night with the President of the United States and Mr. Biden. I believe that was earlier as well. Kevin Cirilli joins us now, our chief Pennsylvania correspondent. There's so many other stories to address, but he's truly, authentically encyclopedic on what we all knew would be a key state. Kevin, which geography in Pennsylvania matters at this hour?
Philadelphia County. I mean, look, I think it's all about the city of brotherly love, which is somewhat symbolic, I think, given the history and the rich history that Philadelphia shares with the country. And without question, all eyes will be on Philadelphia County as those votes continue to come in. But if you're waking up this morning in America, or you're tracking this across the pond with Francine in Europe, bottom line, Georgia, the dominant headline, where Joe Biden has taken a razor-thin lead in the battleground state of Georgia. And I would note that with Georgia specifically, Tom, forget about Nevada. I mean, Joe Biden picks up Georgia, suddenly that could be the state that we're all talking about. And I mentioned that, prior to the election, there's always one state that comes out of nowhere that potentially could really upend this thing. And candidly, it could be Georgia.
Kevin, I need to go to the speech last night. You should have been in that room, that historic room. And folks, it's really something. If you ever have the chance, please visit the messaging of our executive branch and how it's done. Your thoughts on the speech last night and how it will be received by Republicans on Capitol Hill?
Well, I agree with you. And I would note that how it's going to be received by Republicans up on Capitol Hill is going to be something that will be remarkable, because even among some of the staffers that I've been speaking with throughout the day yesterday, they were very apprehensive of how the president came out in the hours following Election Day in the early morning.